Her groom vanished, but the real nightmare had just walked in. Elena was standing at the altar, humiliated in front of 200 guests when the cathedral doors exploded open and a cold-eyed stranger took over the wedding like he owned fate itself. Her fiancé hadn't just run away, he had stolen millions and left her holding the debt, and this man, Damien Volkov, didn't come to comfort her. He came with the craziest deal possible: marry him instead or lose everything. This wasn't a wedding anymore. It was a trap dressed like salvation.
The matrimonial ceremony, intended as a stabilizing event, instead precipitated a severe psychological crisis for the subject. Elena Carter. She was abandoned at the altar before 200 witnesses in a borrowed dress. Her fiancé had absconded, her finances were depleted, and her daughter displayed confusion in the front pew. The cathedral doors were then forced open by an unknown male exhibiting alpha-dominant behavior that commanded submission. This individual, Damien Volkov, was not present for felicitation but to collect a debt incurred by the subject's fiancé, for which he proposed a coercive solution. The subject's trauma manifested initially as selective inattention. She only registered the wilting flowers after the onset of auditory phenomena she perceived as whispers. She displayed extreme somatic tension, her hands clenched. Environmental stimuli such as the scent of lilies and refracted light induced vertigo instead of sentiment. 200 guests were in attendance. The collective murmurs of the attendees escalated with each passing minute. Reverend Morris showed nonverbal anxiety, glancing toward a side entrance for the 14th time. His smile had appeared strained for 20 minutes. "I'm sure he's just..." "Traffic can be unpredictable," the Reverend offered, avoiding eye contact. The subject nodded, unable to speak due to a reported sensation of laryngeal constriction. In the front pew, her daughter Rosie, aged 4, exhibited age-appropriate impatience, asking repeatedly for cake. Elena's associate, Sarah, sat with the child, her expression shifting from supportive to concerned, and finally to anger over a 10-minute period. The crowd's whispers grew into audible complaints of impatience and secondhand embarrassment. Each negative comment was perceived by Elena as a physical assault, triggering a somatic heat response in her neck and face. She experienced an intense flight impulse and a desire for temporal regression to a point 6 months prior to meeting Marcus Chen. Her vulnerability was rooted in her status as a single mother with an absentee ex-partner forced to work excessive hours. Marcus, with his presentation of wealth and promises of security, exploited this desperation. The rapid 3-month courtship was a classic grooming technique, culminating in this public spectacle designed for maximum impact upon his disappearance. Sarah's voice penetrated the subject's dissociative state. Having relocated the child, she approached the altar, her footsteps echoing on the marble. "Honey, I tried calling him again. It goes directly to voicemail." "Maybe his phone died," Elena offered, her voice cracking with strain. "For an hour, perhaps he had an accident, maybe he's hurt." Sarah's jaw tensed. "Maybe he's a coward who doesn't deserve you." As the Reverend began to intervene, the cathedral doors burst open with a sound like a gunshot. The assembly turned in unison. The subject experienced acute tachycardia, coupled with a brief, desperate hope it was Marcus. Instead, 3 men entered. The 2 flanking men moved with the discipline of security personnel. The leader projected an aura of such dominance that it altered the room's atmosphere. He was tall, dressed in expensive black, with severe features and eyes so pale they appeared silver. His movements demonstrated an innate authority that demanded space rather than requesting it. Others ceded ground unconsciously. The subject entered a state of motor paralysis, unable to move or breathe, clutching her bouquet as he approached. At the altar steps, his intimidating presence was magnified. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with an impassive face that signaled significant personal danger. His pale eyes performed a brief, clinical assessment of her before turning to the Reverend. "You can dismiss the guests," he stated in a low voice with a faint Eastern European accent. "The groom isn't coming," the stranger declared with the dispassion of a weather report. "This wedding is over." The ambient whispers erupted into open conversation. Elena reported auditory gasps and shocked remarks as her peripheral vision began to blur. Sarah stepped forward in a protective stance. "Excuse me, but who the hell are you?" The man's gaze shifted to her. "Not your concern." "Like hell it's not." "Sarah." Elena's voice was thin and tremulous. "It's okay. It is not okay. This guy just... Please." The subject's legs were trembling violently. She instructed Sarah to take Rosie outside to prevent a collapse. Sarah complied, seemingly reacting to Elena's visible distress. The child's query, "Mommy, what's happening?" echoed in the ensuing silence as they departed with most of the guests. Elena reported feeling the humiliation settle into her bones. Within 5 minutes, the cathedral was occupied only by Elena, the uncomfortable Reverend, and Damien Volkov with his 2 silent associates. Volkov ascended the 3 altar steps, stopping before Elena. His proximity was unsettling, not due to any overt cruelty. His expression was neutral, but because he viewed her as an object, a problem requiring a solution. "Elena Carter," he stated. She nodded, having lost her voice again. "My name is Damien Volkov." He paused, and when she showed no recognition, a micro-expression flickered across his face. "Your fiancé stole from me." The subject's cognitive processing faltered. "What?" "Marcus Chen," Damien said, his tone unchanged. "Took $12 million from an investment fund I manage. He escalated a small-scale fraud operation 3 months ago. He falsified documents, created fake accounts, and transferred funds." Damien elaborated. Elena's motor functions failed, and she grasped the altar rail for support. "That's not..." "Marcus wouldn't." "Marcus did." Damien presented a phone with digital evidence, bank statements, wire transfers, and emails bearing Marcus's name. The numbers were incomprehensibly large. "This is a mistake," she whispered, her voice sounding distant. "He's a consultant." "He's a thief," Damien countered, pocketing the device. "And he left the country 2 hours ago for a location with no extradition treaty?" The subject experienced acute vertigo. Damien's hand caught her elbow, an impersonal, functional gesture to prevent her fall. "Sit!" It was a command. Elena complied, her legs no longer able to support her. Damien retreated slightly, his hands pocketed, observing her with detached, clinical scrutiny. "You were unaware," he concluded. Of course I was unaware. The retort was sharper than she intended. My belief was that we were... Her voice fractured. She covered her face, a futile effort to maintain composure before the man who had just systematically deconstructed her life. "What is my position now?" The query was muffled by her fingers. "You are in debt." Elena's hands fell. "What?" "Marcus designated you a beneficiary across several accounts. You executed the documents 2 months prior. Do you recall?" She did. Marcus had presented papers at her apartment, framing it as a standard premarital procedure, a consolidation of finances. She'd been folding Rosie's clothing, her attention diverted from the forms she was signing. "Those instruments," Damien clarified, "render you legally culpable for a percentage of the embezzled funds." The world seemed to collapse beneath her. The total? $3 million! A laugh escaped Elena, high-pitched and bordering on hysterical. My annual income is $28,000. My savings account contains $600. It's impossible. There is no mechanism by which I could ever. I am aware. Damien's expression remained impassive. For this reason, we must explore alternatives. Alternatives? Elena's gaze lifted to him. The stranger in a costly black suit who had entered the wreckage of her wedding bearing catastrophic information. What kind of alternatives? Damien glanced toward the clergyman who lingered near the altar, his eyes wide. Leave us. Reverend Morris began to speak, looked toward Elena, then evidently reconsidered his statement. He gave a nod and rushed toward the vestry. Once they were isolated, save for two silent figures posted by the doors, Damien refocused on Elena. The money is of no consequence to me, he stated. Its recovery will occur through other means. My objective is to deliver a message. A message that theft from my organization carries repercussions. That individuals who violate my trust are held accountable. He paused. Yet, you are not Marcus Chen. To ruin you would establish nothing except my capacity for misdirected retribution. Elena's heart pounded with a force she felt in her throat. So what is your proposition? My proposition is that I will absolve the debt. A flare of desperate hope ignited within her. Truly, under a single condition. The hope was extinguished. Elena waited. Damien's pale gaze locked with hers. Marry me instead. For an extended moment, Elena simply stared. She had to have misheard. This had to be a hallucination induced by shock. You are jesting. I do not jest regarding business matters. This is not a business matter. This is... She gestured to the vacant cathedral, the floral arrangements, the deserted altar. This is pathological. It is pragmatic. Damien's tone was infuriatingly composed. I require a wife for purposes that are not your concern. You require insulation from the legal and financial fallout of Marcus's actions. We each provide a solution to the other's problem. Elena rose, her legs unsteady, but her anger lending her strength. I am not a problem requiring a solution. I am a person. I am cognizant of that. And you cannot simply... People do not just... She was stammering, overwhelmed by fury and terror. I do not even know you. You did not know Marcus either. The statement was delivered with cold precision. And he abandoned you at an altar before 200 guests. My approach, at least, is transparent. The comment struck with more force than it should have. Elena felt tears welling and fiercely suppressed them. She refused to display such weakness before this man. What precisely are you proposing? She forced the words out with manufactured steadiness. A legally binding marriage. You will reside in my home, appear at designated functions as my wife, and project the image of a committed relationship. In return, I will nullify your debt, provide for you and your child, and ensure Marcus's entanglement does not affect you. The duration? 3 years. Following that, a quiet dissolution of the marriage. You will be granted a settlement ensuring your and your daughter's financial security. Elena's thoughts were in turmoil. This was not plausible. Such arrangements did not happen in reality. And what is your gain in this? She inquired. Beyond this message, you wish to send about consequences. Miss... Something shifted in Damien's expression, too fast to analyze, but present. That is not your concern. If I am to marry you, every facet of this is my concern. He appraised her for a long moment. Elena met his gaze, though every instinct urged her to look away. My business interests demand a particular public image, Damien said at last. Stability. familial values. A wife projects that. You mean you require a facade of respectability, if you wish to frame it that way? And I am a convenient choice, being already attired for the part. A muscle in his jaw might have twitched. Possibly, among other factors. Elena folded her arms across her chest. The wedding dress felt absurd, a relic of a future that never was, worn for a man offering a different, equally fabricated future. What of Rosie? The question was softer now. Your daughter would cohabitate with us. She would be provided for and kept safe. From what? Damien's expression hardened. From parties who might view Marcus's liabilities as leverage to be used against you. There exist organizations with less patience than my own. A chill traced its way down Elena's spine. You are implying we are in danger? I am stating that you will be, should you decline my offer. He allowed the implication to settle. Marcus's theft was not limited to my assets. He stole from other entities who will be indifferent to your innocence. They will perceive you as an asset for liquidation. You are threatening me. I am offering you sanctuary. Damien's voice was uninflected. There is a distinction. Elena wanted to scream that there was no distinction, that this was merely coercion cloaked in expensive tailoring and calm tones. Yet she looked at his face and detected no malice, only dispassionate tactical analysis. He was entirely serious. I require time to process this, she said. You have 5 minutes. That is not 5 minutes, Damien reiterated. Or I exit through that door, and you will face the consequences of Marcus's actions alone. Elena's hands trembled again. She pressed them to her stomach, trying to reason through the rising panic. What were her options? Flee? To where? She possessed $600 and a 4-year-old child. Involve the authorities? To report what? That her fiancé was a thief? And she had blindly signed incriminating documents? Retain counsel? With what funds? What about my employment? The question was unexpected, but once spoken, she needed an answer. You would resign? I cannot just... You would have no financial need to work. All necessities would be met. I like my job. This was not entirely accurate. The diner was grueling, the wages poor, but it was her own. It was something she had earned. Damien shrugged. Retain it if you wish. It is immaterial to me. And after 3 years, upon our divorce, you will possess sufficient capital to pursue any endeavor you choose. Higher education, a new business, a life of leisure if you prefer. The offer seemed too perfect to be real, which suggested a flaw. What is the caveat? Elena asked. There is always a caveat. The caveat, Damien said, is that you will be my wife. That status carries with it expectations, public presentation, discretion, and loyalty. Loyalty. Betrayal will not be tolerated. His pale eyes fixed on hers. Be unfaithful, disseminate information about me, or attempt to subvert me in any capacity, and this protection will vanish along with all other provisions. A knot formed in Elena's stomach. I would never. Excellent. He consulted his watch. 2 minutes. This is madness. But she was already engaged in a cost-benefit analysis, running simulations in her mind. Rosie's childcare expenses exceeded Elena's weekly earnings. Their rent was 2 months in arrears. The car required urgent repairs. And now, unknown individuals might pursue them for a debt they could not pay. 1 minute. I require assurances, Elena said, her voice rapid. Regarding Rosie, she is the priority, without exception. Whatever this arrangement is, she will not be harmed by it. Agreed. And I require a formal contract detailing everything. The debt absolution, the timeline, the settlement terms. My legal counsel will draft an agreement. My own counsel must review it. Damien's eyebrow arched slightly. You do not have counsel, then I will acquire it. I am not signing another document without full comprehension. For the first time, a flicker of what might have been approval crossed his features. Prudent, 30 seconds. Elena's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. This was a profoundly irrational course of action. This was the worst possible choice. This was, if I consent. She began slowly. When would this take place? Damien gestured to the empty cathedral surrounding them. The Reverend remains on site. The marriage license is filed. The matter could be concluded in 20 minutes. Today? Elena's voice rose in pitch. You propose we marry today? The venue has been compensated for. That is not... She pressed her hands to her temples, a headache beginning to throb. I cannot just marry a stranger in the dress meant for another ceremony. It is efficient, Damien completed. It is deranged. Perhaps, he checked his watch once more, but your allotted time has expired. What is your decision? Elena looked at him, this cold, formidable stranger who had appeared in the ruins of her life to offer an alternate pact with the devil. Then her thoughts turned to Rosie waiting outside, confused. She thought of the apartment they would surely lose. She thought of dangerous people seeking restitution. She thought of standing at this altar 20 minutes ago, convinced Marcus was merely delayed, hoping he would appear and rescue her. No one was coming to rescue her. Salvation was her own responsibility. One condition, Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. My initial observation must be of Rosie. The subject must rationalize this to her. There is nothing to rationalize. She is 4. She is my progeny. Elena elevated her chin, and she is owed an awareness of the situation, even if comprehension is limited. This point is not subject to debate. They maintained eye contact. Elena's cardiac rhythm accelerated. She anticipated his refusal, his departure, a nullification of the terms. Instead, Damien gave a single nod. Agreed. 5 minutes with your offspring, then we will continue. He produced a mobile device and initiated a call, speaking in clipped Russian. Elena deciphered approximately 3 words. Child, retrieve, and immediately. Terminating the call, he regarded her with expectation. It is imperative you understand, Elena stated, the firmness in her tone surprising her. My compliance is for Rosie's protection. It is not based on trust, nor do I accept this arrangement. It is solely for her. Your motivation is irrelevant to me. Damien's expression remained impassive. Only your compliance matters, and it is imperative you understand that should you harm her, my daughter, I will devise a method to ensure your regret. I am indifferent to your power or what you might inflict upon me. This time, a definite movement at the corner of Damien's mouth. Not quite a smile, but an approximation. Acknowledged, he stated. The cathedral door swung open. Sarah entered bearing Rosie, asleep on her shoulder. One of Damien's operatives followed. Sarah's eyes were inflamed, evidence of recent weeping. Upon seeing Elena still with Damien, her expression hardened. What precisely is occurring? She demanded. This individual's associates are detaining us, refusing to provide any information. The situation is under control. Elena descended the altar steps, her arms extended for her child. I will provide a full debriefing. Sarah transferred Rosie with visible reluctance. The child shifted but remained unconscious, nestling into Elena's shoulder with the absolute trust characteristic of the young. Elena held her, inhaling the scent of her shampoo, registering her warm weight. "Sarah," she said in a low voice, "I require you to trust me." "Trust you in what capacity?" "Elena, what is this?" "I am rectifying the situation." Elena observed her friend, her sole confidant, the one individual who had remained through every crisis. "And I require you to refrain from inquiries at this time, please." Sarah's jaw tensed. Her gaze shifted between Elena and Damien, attempting to synthesize the missing data. "This pertains to Marcus, correct?" she finally concluded. "To his actions." Elena did not respond. "I knew he was a psychological anomaly." Sarah's voice was heavy with emotion. "I warned you his presentation was too perfect." "You did," Elena conceded quietly. "Your assessment was accurate. So, what is your intended course of action?" Elena looked at Rosie's dormant face, at the small hands resting on her chest, at the pink dress acquired through excess labor hours. "I'm going to ensure her safety," Elena stated, "by any means necessary." She kissed Rosie's forehead, then carefully returned her to Sarah's arms. "Take her to your residence," she instructed. "I will contact you this evening with an explanation." "Elena, please, Sarah, just trust me." Sarah's eyes welled again, but she acquiesced. She secured her hold on Rosie, then fixed Damien with a look of extreme hostility. "If you cause her harm," Sarah stated softly, "I will commit the entirety of my life to the destruction of yours." Damien's expression was unchanged. The cue forms behind her. Sarah blinked, the response clearly unexpected. She then turned and carried Rosie out, escorted by one of Damien's men. Once they departed, Elena turned to face him again. "Very well," she said. "Let us proceed before I reconsider." Damien gestured to a subordinate who vanished into the sacristy. He returned with Reverend Morris, who appeared profoundly unsettled. "Reverend," Damien said, "we are prepared." "I am uncertain this is." The Reverend looked at Elena. "Are you absolutely sure about this course of action, my dear?" "No," Elena's internal monologue stated, but she verbalized, "Yes. This is highly unorthodox. Life is unorthodox." Damien's tone indicated the subject was closed. "Commence." The Reverend appeared ready to protest, but some quality in Damien's demeanor compelled him to suppress his objection. He opened his Bible with trembling hands. Elena stood at the altar a second time that day, in the same attire, with the same deteriorating flowers. But this time the man beside her was an unknown entity, with cold eyes and colder assurances. The Reverend started the ceremony. Elena processed little of the language. She experienced a dissociative state, observing another woman in a borrowed dress consenting to a union with a man encountered 20 minutes prior. Damien's responses were terse and transactional. When prompted for the rings, he produced a plain gold band from his pocket. Its origin was a mystery to Elena. It was too large, rotating loosely after he placed it on her finger. "I now declare you husband and wife," Reverend Morris said, audibly relieved. "You may kiss the bride." Elena's visceral response was one of dread. She had not considered this component. Damien observed her, his expression unreadable. He then leaned forward. Elena instinctively closed her eyes. His lips made brief, impersonal contact with her forehead, lasting a second. When Elena opened her eyes, he had already retreated. "Congratulations," the Reverend offered feebly. Damien produced an envelope from his jacket and gave it to him. "For your silence." The Reverend accepted it with unsteady fingers and hastily exited. Then they were alone. husband and wife, married. Elena examined the loose gold band on her finger. That morning, she had anticipated marrying Marcus. Now she was married to Damien Volkov, a man about whom she knew nothing except that he was dangerous and she had owed him $3 million. No, the debt was canceled. That was the agreement. "What is the next phase?" she asked. Damien was already moving toward the exit. "Now you return home. I need my effects, my apartment. It will be managed. My personnel will collect your possessions." "I have items I must catalog." He did not decelerate. "Anything you wish to retain will be brought. All else will be disposed of." Elena had to half jog to match his long strides. "You cannot simply—" "I can." He pushed open the cathedral doors. The sunlight caused Elena to squint. A black vehicle was waiting, sleek and costly, its windows obscured. One of Damien's men held the rear door open. "Enter," Damien ordered. Elena remained on the church steps in her wedding dress, observing the open car door. This was the final decision point, the last opportunity to refuse, to engage with lawyers and collection agencies. She visualized Rosie's small, trusting face. Elena entered the car. Damien took the seat beside her. The door shut with a heavy sound. The interior smelled of leather and a sharp cologne. The seats were soft and Elena sank into them. The driver pulled away from the curb without a sound. Elena watched the cathedral vanish in the mirror. "What is our destination?" she inquired. "My estate, approximately 40 minutes from the city." "Estate?" Elena turned to face him. "You reside on an estate? Correct? What is your profession precisely?" The question had been a persistent thought since his mention of investment funds. "For employment. I manage assets. That is ambiguous." Damien's pale eyes met hers. "By design." "I have just married you. I believe I am entitled to less ambiguity." "You married me to nullify a debt. My profession was not a term of the agreement." Elena's hands clenched in her lap. "Fine. Then detail the expectations of this arrangement. You mentioned public functions." "Periodically, yes. Business dinners, charity functions. You will require suitable attire." "I possess attire." His gaze scanned her wedding dress, borrowed, ill-fitting. A stain on the hem she had attempted to remediate. "You will require different attire," he corrected. A flush rose up Elena's neck. "I am capable of dressing myself." "I am certain you are, but you now represent me. That necessitates a specific standard." "Are you saying you are ashamed to be seen with me?" "I am saying you are ill-equipped for the environment you are entering. That is not a pejorative. It is a statement of fact." Elena suppressed the retort forming on her tongue. He was. From a technical standpoint, correct? She possessed no framework for his operational milieu, a fact that failed to numb the sting of his words. They proceeded in silence as the urban landscape dissolved into suburbs and then pastoral settings. The road became flanked by trees, the residences growing in scale and separation. Elena's physiological reserves were depleting. The acute stress response that sustained her through the morning's crisis was now subsiding, leaving a state of tremors and emotional emptiness. "May I pose a query?" she finally articulated. Damien's gaze remained fixed outside. "You may ask." "Why select me? If a wife is a necessity, surely there are candidates within your own circles, individuals already acclimated to this reality." "There are." "Then why resort to coercion with a subject like me?" He turned his attention to her then. "Because you are incapable of forming an emotional attachment to me." The statement's bluntness was startling. What? So, females in my sphere carry expectations, romance, stability, proximity to power. You desire none of that. Your motivations are the safety of your child and release from financial liability. This makes your behavior predictable and therefore manageable. Manageable, Elena echoed. The term left a bitter taste. This is not a personal matter. It feels deeply personal. Then you must cultivate a higher tolerance for emotional distress. Elena averted her gaze, fighting a sudden lacrimation. She resolved not to cry again in his presence. The vehicle entered a private drive, transitioning from woods to sculpted grounds. In the distance, a structure became visible. Not a house, but a mansion. 3 levels of pale stone, complete with columns and vast windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Is this your residence? The question emerged fainter than she intended. This is our residence now, Damien corrected. The car halted at the main entrance. A man in a dark suit opened Elena's door before she could move. Her borrowed shoes crunched on the gravel as she exited. The mansion loomed, its scale immense and utterly alien to the small apartment she'd left that morning. Damien rounded the vehicle. Come, I will show you to your room. My room. Elena trailed him up the stairs. Are we not supposed to? Our marriage is a legal contract, not a domestic reality. He opened the heavy, intricately carved front doors. You will have your own wing, I have mine. A wave of relief washed over her. Oh, good. The interior was as imposing as the facade. It featured marble floors, soaring ceilings, and a grand cinematic staircase. The environment was immaculate, cold, and opulent. A woman with gray hair in a bun, dressed in a plain black dress, emerged from a hallway. Sir, she greeted with a slight accent. Welcome home. Mrs. Kovach, this is Elena, my wife. She is now in residence here. Damien's tone was clinical. Please have the East Wing guest suite prepared for her. Mrs. Kovach's eyes showed a flicker of surprise before she composed herself. Of course, immediately. Elena will supply a list of personal effects to be collected from her previous apartment. Ensure it is handled with discretion. Yes, sir. Damien moved toward the staircase, expecting her to follow. She complied, her limbs heavy with fatigue. On the second floor, they traversed a corridor of paintings. She was too exhausted to register. Damien opened a door near the end of the hall. The space is yours, he stated. Elena entered and nearly laughed at the absurdity. The room was larger than her entire former apartment. It contained a king-sized bed, a seating area, and huge windows that overlooked distant gardens. The lavatory is through there, Damien indicated another door. Mrs. Kovach will provide for any needs you have. Dinner is at 7. Your attendance is not mandatory tonight if you require rest. Elena turned to face him, her husband, the stranger. What is the protocol now? She asked for the second time that day. Now, Damien said, you adapt. This will be your environment for the next 3 years. I advise you to acclimate. He began to exit, then paused. One final point, he added without turning back. The ring is a placeholder. I will have a more suitable one commissioned. We must not allow the perception that I am frugal. He then departed, the door closing with a soft click. Elena stood alone in her gilded cage, still in her wedding attire, staring at the ill-fitting gold band on her finger. The transaction was complete. She had married a stranger to secure her daughter's safety. She had exchanged one form of confinement for another, with no certainty as to the wisdom of her choice. Elena awoke in a state of disorientation, heart racing with no immediate sense of place. The ceiling was incorrect, too high, too white. The mattress was too soft. The ambient scent was foreign, like lavender and an unidentifiable luxury fragrance. Then memory flooded back. The cathedral, Damien, the coercive wedding. She sat upright, still clad in the dress, which was now twisted and deeply creased. The loose ring glinted in the morning light from the uncovered windows. Her phone was on the nightstand, placed there by one of Damien's staff. 17 missed calls from Sarah, 12 text messages. Elena's hands trembled as she accessed them. What in God's name is happening? Call me immediately. Elena, I am not joking. Rosie is asking for you. If I do not hear from you in the next hour, I am notifying the authorities. The final message was sent 20 minutes prior. Elena initiated the call reflexively. Sarah answered on the first ring. Where are you? I am safe. Is Rosie? Rosie is fine. She's consuming cereal and watching cartoons. Do you want to explain why her mother is absent? Elena winced at the accusation in Sarah's voice. I know you are upset. Upset? I'm far beyond that. You vanished with some Russian criminal yesterday, leaving your child with me. No context, nothing. Just trust me. Followed by 16 hours of silence. He's not a criminal. Elena was unsure why she felt compelled to defend Damien, perhaps to convince herself. Then what is he? It is complex. Uncomplicate. Elena closed her eyes, searching for a starting point. Marcus misappropriated funds from him, a significant amount, and due to documents I signed, I am legally liable for a portion. A pause on the line, then, how much? $3 million. Sarah's intake of breath was sharp. Jesus Christ! Damien proposed forgiving the debt in exchange for marriage. It is a contractual arrangement. 3 years, we dissolve the marriage, and Rosie and I are financially secure. The words sounded hollow, even to her. So you genuinely married him? Sarah's tone had become flat. That wasn't some fever dream I had. I was left with no other option. There is always an option. Not when the alternative involves total ruin and placing Rosie at risk. Elena's throat constricted. Marcus had other victims, individuals who would not care about my ignorance of his actions. More silence. In the background, Rosie could be heard singing along with a cartoon. Where are you located right now? Sarah asked finally. His estate outside the city. Send me the address. Sarah, send me the address or Rosie remains with me until you comply. Elena almost produced a laugh. You can't abduct my daughter. Observe me. But Sarah's voice had softened. I need to verify your well-being to ensure this isn't some form of a hostage scenario. It is not. Prove it. Let me bring Rosie to you. Let me see your living conditions. Elena surveyed the vast bedroom, the opulence surrounding her like an alien territory. Okay, but you must promise to avoid creating a scene. I will create any scene necessary if I perceive you are in danger. Sarah, please, this is already difficult enough. Her friend sighed. Fine. Text me the location. We will arrive in 1 hour. The call disconnected. Elena sat on the bed's edge in her ruined dress from the previous day, strategizing her next move. She required a shower, clean clothes, and coffee to counteract the feeling of having been struck by a vehicle. She located the bathroom, a space of marble and gold fixtures larger than her old bedroom, and shed the wedding dress. It pooled on the floor. Elena left it, wanting never to see it again. The shower had some 15 settings. She simply turned a knob until hot water emerged and remained under the spray until her skin was flushed. Upon emerging in a towel likely worth more than her car, she discovered clothing arranged on the bed. Jeans, a soft gray sweater, and new undergarments, all in her size. The precision of the act was unsettling. How did they have this information? When had someone entered the room? She dressed with haste, then set out in search of coffee and the person managing the household. The residence was even more imposing by day. Elena became disoriented twice while looking for the stairs, at one point finding herself in a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, before she finally located the main staircase. Voices carried up from a lower level. One was Damien's, speaking in the same rapid Russian she recognized from yesterday. Elena followed the sound to a dining room capable of seating 20. Damien was at the head of a long table with his phone to his ear and a laptop open. He was in different attire, dark trousers and a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves. He appeared to have been awake for hours. He looked up as she entered, indicated the empty seats, and resumed his call. Elena took a seat, feeling out of place. Mrs. Kovacs materialized from a side door. "Coffee, Mrs. Volkov?" The surname made Elena's stomach lurch. "Yes, please, black." "Are you hungry? I can have breakfast made." Elena's stomach audibly responded for her. "That would be acceptable." "Thank you." Mrs. Kovacs nodded and withdrew. Damien concluded his call and closed his laptop. "You remained in your dress," he noted. "I was fatigued." "Evidently." He poured more coffee from a carafe. "Mrs. Kovacs reports your friend is bringing your daughter here this morning. I was uncertain if that was permitted. This is your residence now. You do not require permission for guests." The term home felt incongruous. This was not a home. Home was the apartment with the faulty plumbing and the neighbor's nocturnal canine. This was merely a well-appointed enclosure. "Thank you," Elena said regardless. Mrs. Kovacs returned with a plate of eggs, toast, and fruit aesthetically arranged. Elena consumed it, experiencing a sudden, intense hunger. Damien observed her over the rim of his cup. "My legal counsel arrives at noon. You will execute the contract then." "I require my own counsel to review it." "That has been arranged." His arrival is confirmed for 11:30. Elena put down her fork. "Your execution is swift." "I do not permit delays." He rose, securing his cuffs. "I have calls requiring my attention. Inform me of any needs." He was nearly at the door when she spoke again. "What am I to tell Rosie?" Damien paused. "In reference to what?" "This situation, your presence. She will have questions." "Relay the facts. That we are married and this is her residence now." "She is 4. Such a concept will not compute for her." "Then simplify the data until it does." His tone indicated the subject was closed. "Children are resilient. She will acclimate." "You understand nothing about children." An unreadable expression flickered across his face. "No, I do not." Then he was gone, leaving Elena with a costly breakfast and the sinking realization of a catastrophic error in judgment. Sarah's vehicle arrived at exactly 9:30. Elena watched from the steps as her friend emerged, assessed the mansion, and stated, "You cannot be serious." Rosie emerged from the vehicle's rear, her socks mismatched, wearing the shirt she'd slept in. Upon seeing Elena, her expression became euphoric. "Mommy." Elena absorbed her into an embrace that almost unbalanced her. The child smelled of maple syrup and Sarah's laundry soap, and Elena maintained the hold longer than was standard. I missed you, my dear. Sarah said you were at a sleepover. Rosie pulled back, her gaze intense. Without me. I know, my apologies. Is this your new home? Rosie's focus had already transferred to the estate behind them. It is very large. It is indeed. Elena placed her down, taking her hand. Shall we see the interior? Sarah ascended the steps behind them, her face a mixture of awe and alarm. This is pathological, she murmured. This is genuinely pathological. I am aware. No, you aren't. Elena, this... She gestured toward the columns, the immense door. This is not how people live. Evidently, some do. Inside, Rosie's eyes widened. Whoa, a sentiment I can echo, Sarah muttered. Miss Kovac materialized, observed the guests, and offered a warm smile. You must be Rosie. Your mother has told me of you. The child retreated behind Elena's legs, suddenly timid. It is all right, my dear. This is Mrs. Kovac. She helps manage the household. Would you care for some cookies? Mrs. Kovac inquired. I have just prepared a fresh batch. At the mention of cookies, Rosie's reticence vanished. Yes, please. Mrs. Kovac extended her hand. Accompany me to the kitchen. You can assist me in arranging them on a platter. Rosie glanced at Elena for confirmation. Elena consented, though every parental instinct registered a high alert against letting her child out of her sight in this unknown environment. Once they departed, Sarah confronted her. Explain, what is the actual nature of this situation? Elena guided her into a receiving room near the entryway and shut the door. As I said, it is a business arrangement. Business arrangements do not include estates and domestic staff. Sarah paced, her state agitated. What is this man's profession? And do not say asset management. That is a euphemism. I do not know the specifics. Then ascertain them. Elena, you have married a complete stranger. You reside in his home. You have a daughter to consider. Do you believe I am unaware of that? Elena's voice escalated. That I am not terrified, but what was my alternative? Marcus vanished, leaving me liable for $3 million I don't possess. Damien presented a solution. By ensnaring you in a different form of confinement. It is not a prison. I am free to leave at any time. Sarah halted her pacing. Are you, though, genuinely? The question lingered between them. Elena wanted to affirm, but she lacked certainty. The agreement was not yet finalized. She did not know the terms. I need you to trust my judgment, Elena stated quietly. I know this appears irrational. It is irrational. But I am taking the necessary steps to ensure Rosie's safety. Sarah's expression softened. She crossed the space and embraced Elena. I trust you. I do not trust him. That makes two of us. They remained in that position for a moment, Elena drawing on her friend's stable presence. Sarah had been a constant through every crisis, the pregnancy, the separation from Rosie's father, the sequence of inadequate jobs and housing. She was the only individual who had never regarded Elena with pity or condemnation. Promise me one thing, Sarah said near her ear. If this deteriorates, you contact me, regardless of the time or circumstances you call, and I will retrieve you. I promise. The door opened. The two women separated abruptly. Damien was in the doorway, still dressed for work, his expression neutral. The legal counsel has arrived early. We should commence. Sarah's posture became rigid. You must be the husband. And you must be the friend. Damien's gaze shifted between them. I presume Elena has briefed you on our arrangement. She informed me that you coerced her into marriage. Sarah, Elena interjected. It is fine. Damien's tone remained flat. She is acting as your protector. He looked directly at Sarah. That is admirable, but superfluous. I have no intention of causing harm to Elena or her daughter. Stevwo, you will forgive my reluctance to accept your word. I am not requesting your acceptance. His focus returned to Elena. The lawyers are in my study. Proceed at your own pace. He departed without awaiting her reply. Sarah stared after his retreating form. He is unsettling. I know. Like, clinically frightening. Those eyes. I know. And he is your husband. Elena glanced at the ill-fitting ring on her finger. For 3 years. The contract consisted of 47 pages. Elena sat in Damien's study, a room of leather, dark wood, and unread books. As her state-provided lawyer, a nervous man named Philip Reeves, detailed each clause. Damien was seated opposite, his own counsel beside him. They remained silent unless directly questioned by Elena. Clause 7, Reeves stated, adjusting his spectacles. This section outlines the financial provisions. Mr. Volkov will grant a monthly stipend of $15,000 for personal expenses. All household, medical, and childcare costs are covered independently. Elena's coffee cup halted midair. $15,000 a month? Is the sum inadequate? Damien inquired. That exceeds my earnings over 6 months at the diner. You will no longer be employed at the diner. I have not yet resigned. A slight arch of his eyebrow. You intend to continue working there? I am undecided. Perhaps. Elena lowered the cup. The contract permits it. The contract permits many things. Let us proceed. Reeves cleared his throat. Clause 12 concerns the marriage itself. You and Mr. Volkov are to maintain separate bedchambers. There is no expectation of conjugal relations. However, in public, you are mandated to present as a married couple. This includes physical contact when deemed appropriate. Define appropriate, Elena said. Damien's lawyer, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Stern, responded. Hand-holding, an arm at the waist, a perfunctory kiss on the cheek, nothing to cause discomfort to either party. And if I find all of it uncomfortable, and all of it, then public engagements will be minimized. Damien's voice was even. But some will be unavoidable. That point is non-negotiable. Elena gave a slow nod. Understood. Clause 18, Reeves went on, pertains to the child. Rosie will reside here full-time. Mr. Volkov commits to providing for all her needs, encompassing education, health care, and enrichment activities. You retain complete parental authority, but Mr. Volkov requests consultation on significant decisions. What kind of decisions? Elena inquired. Educational institutions, medical interventions, anything of consequence. Elena looked at Damien. Why? Because if she is under my roof, I bear responsibility for her welfare. He settled back into his chair. This does not imply I am replacing her father. It implies I will not be a peripheral figure in her life for 3 years. The logic was sound, terrifyingly so. Elena had anticipated demands, control, perhaps cruelty, not this detached pragmatism. Fine, she stated. They reviewed the remainder of the contract, confidentiality agreements, behavioral expectations in public, and the settlement she would get after 3 years, a figure so large Elena had to read it twice to process it. This cannot be a real offer, she said at last. It is real. Damien's gaze had not left her throughout the meeting. 3 years of your compliance is worth that sum to me. Why? What do you gain from this arrangement? That is not your concern. It is entirely my concern. For the first time, a shift occurred in Damien's expression. It was not anger, but resembled someone weighing the utility of revealing a truth. I have associates who prioritize stability, he finally stated. Family men. They are distrustful of bachelors. A wife and child render me acceptable to them. So it was about perception. Everything was about perception. Elena wanted to debate, but was too fatigued and overwhelmed. She looked to Reeves. Is this agreement fair? The lawyer paused. It is highly unconventional, but from a legal perspective, it secures your interests. The financial terms are exceedingly generous. The termination clause is unambiguous. Most critically, it absolves you of all liability connected to Marcus Chen's fraudulent acts. That was the deciding factor. The remaining formalities were transactional. Where do I sign? Elena signed her name 7 times. Damien did likewise. Lawyers witnessed and notarized the documents, finalizing a binding 3-year contract. Congratulations, one lawyer said, collecting the papers. I'll file these. Once they were alone, Damien poured a drink. You did well, he observed. I signed my life away, she responded. I don't think that qualifies as doing well. You secured your daughter's future, he corrected, reframing her capitulation as a victory. He watched her over his glass. Your friend is still here. She's in the garden with Rosie. How do you know that? She asked. I have security cameras, he replied, establishing his total surveillance and control. A predictable response. Are you observing us presently? Is observation warranted? Subject Elena exhibited kinetic agitation, a physical manifestation of acute anxiety. I must speak with Rosie to frame our continued presence here. Is my attendance required? The inquiry seemed to disarm her. Do you wish to be present? A controlled introduction is preferable to an incidental encounter in the corridor. His logic was sound, a fact that offered no psychological comfort. Agreed, Elena stated. Let us proceed. They located the secondary subjects, Sarah and Rosie, in the designated East Garden, an elaborate space featuring curated flora, a water feature, and trees of significant age. The child, Rosie, was engaged in chasing an insect, her vocalizations echoing across the grounds. The associate, Sarah, was perched on a bench, her posture suggesting a continuous assessment of egress routes. Upon spotting Damien, she rose. Has the debriefing concluded? It was a contractual execution, not a debriefing, Elena corrected. A semantic distinction from my perspective? Rosie approached, displaying signs of mild respiratory distress. Mother, the flowers are ubiquitous, and Mrs. Sue. Do you consume cookies? On occasion, Rosie processed this data. Mrs. Kovach prepares superior cookies. You should sample them. I will consider it. The interaction's superficial normality almost succeeded in masking the situation's profound abnormality for Elena. Almost. Damien and I are now married, Elena resumed, which necessitates our cohabitation with him for a period. You, myself, and Damien. Rosie's brow furrowed in confusion. What of our previous residence? We will not be returning to that apartment. For what reason? This is now our designated home. But my possessions are located there, my playthings, my bed. We will transfer all your possessions here. You will be assigned a new bed, a new room. It will be a novel experience. Rosie appeared unconvinced. What about Sarah? Sarah may visit at her discretion. Elena looked to her associate, who affirmed quickly, "Anytime, child, I am not abandoning you." Rosie redirected her attention to Damien. "Do you possess offspring?" "Negative." "Why is that?" "Time has not been allocated for such an endeavor." "I see." Rosie contemplated this. "Will you now assume the role of my father?" The question created a palpable tension. Elena's physiological functions momentarily ceased. She had not prepared a contingency for this query. Damien crouched, aligning his eye level with Rosie's. His vocal tone softened, a calculated de-escalation tactic. "No. You already possess a father. I am merely your mother's husband. However, I will ensure your and your mother's welfare during your time here. Is this arrangement acceptable?" Rosie regarded him with intense scrutiny before extending her hand. "Affirmative." Damien shook it with performative gravity. "Affirmative." With that, the tension dissipated. Rosie resumed her pursuit of another insect, and Damien rose, removing particulates from his trousers. Sarah observed him with an unreadable expression. "That was a surprisingly adept maneuver." "I am not a monster," Damien replied. "That assessment is still pending." "Sarah," Elena cautioned. "What?" "I am merely verbalizing the prevailing sentiment." Sarah retrieved her handbag from the bench. "I must depart. My work shift commences at 1600 hours. Elena escorted her to her vehicle, with Rosie moving ahead of them. "Will you be all right?" Sarah inquired in a low voice. "That is yet to be determined. He is not consistent with my projections." "What were your projections?" "I am unsure. Someone more overtly menacing, I suppose." "Oh," Sarah activated her car's remote lock. "But that presents a greater risk. The threat that is not immediately perceivable." "Your commentary is not helpful." "My objective is not to help. It is to ensure you maintain a state of heightened vigilance." Sarah initiated a brief embrace. "Contact me tonight, tomorrow, and daily, until I am convinced of your actual safety." "I will." Rosie entered the vehicle for a final hug. Then Sarah departed, the tires displacing gravel. Elena remained in the circular driveway, observing the vehicle's retreat. The mansion loomed behind her. Somewhere within was her new husband, an individual about whom she possessed almost no data. "Your associate is loyal," Damien commented from the top of the stairs. Elena turned, having not detected his approach. "She is the finest person I know." "That is a rarity." "What is?" "Genuine loyalty. Most interpersonal bonds are transactional, not Sarah's. All individuals have a price. Some are simply higher." He descended the staircase. "Mrs. Kovac has transferred your belongings from your apartment. They are located in your room. If you require assistance with unpacking, I am capable." "I have no doubt." He paused. "Dinner is at 1900 hours. As previously stated, you may dine with me, or Mrs. Kovac can deliver a meal to your quarters. It is probably strategic to dine with you, to acclimate Rosie." "As you wish." He began to withdraw. Elena called out his name. "Damien!" He halted, turning back. "Thank you for your statement to Rosie regarding not supplanting her father." "It was a factual statement. I have no interest in simulating a family unit. This is a business arrangement. Honesty regarding this framework is optimal for all parties." The words were intended to be clarifying. Instead, they induced in Elena a feeling of profound emptiness. Later that evening, Elena stood in Rosie's new bedroom. a space twice the area of their former apartment's main room, containing a bed constructed like a fortress and a surplus of toys, and observed her daughter sleeping. Mrs. Kovach had managed the unpacking with extreme efficiency. The child's plush toys were arrayed on shelves. Her clothing was stored in a closet larger than Elena's former bedroom. A nightlight was active in the corner. The scene should have represented success and security. Instead, Elena felt only disorientation. A quiet knock at the door prompted her to turn. Damien was in the hallway, still attired in day wear but with his necktie loosened. "Is she asleep?" he inquired softly. Finally, she required 3 stories and 4 servings of water. A delay tactic, a highly effective one. They paused. Then Damien said, "I wish to discuss a matter with you." A feeling of unease manifested in Elena's abdomen. "Proceed." "There is a charitable function next Saturday. I require your attendance with me." "So soon?" "The sooner we are observed together in public, the sooner inquiries will cease." He assumed a relaxed posture against the doorframe. "The dress code is formal. Mrs. Kovach will procure appropriate attire. I am capable of purchasing my own clothing." "Not for this event. The attendees will recognize if your attire is mass-produced." A flush of heat rose in Elena's neck. "I lack experience in formal social settings." "You do not need to perform. Simply remain by my side and smile when addressed." "That is demeaning." "That is the contract." His tone remained flat. "You were aware of the public appearance clause." Elena wished to protest, but he was correct. She had signed the agreement. She had consented to this. "Fine," she stated. 1 week. "I will be prepared." Damien nodded and began to depart, then paused. "You performed well today," he said without making eye contact. "With Rosie easing this transition for her. She is 4. All things are easier for her than for me. Nevertheless, you are a competent mother." The compliment was unexpected. Before she could formulate a response, he was gone, his footsteps receding down the hall. Elena resumed observing her child, the unfamiliar wedding band, a heavy presence on her finger. 7 days until the gala, 3 years until liberation. She could endure this. She must. For Rosie, she could withstand anything. The week unfolded as a series of alien routines and disquieting adjustments. Elena learned Damien departed for work before 0600 hours and seldom returned before 2000 hours. She learned Mrs. Kovach managed the residence with military-like precision. She learned the East Wing contained 12 rooms, largely unused, and that Rosie had appropriated 3 for her imaginative play. What she did not learn was any substantive information about her husband. He was civil during dinner on the occasions he was present. He inquired about Rosie's day, absorbing her nonlinear narratives with apparent focus. He never elevated his voice, issued commands, or gave Elena any objective cause for fear. Yet she could not dismiss the sensation of cohabitating with an unknown entity who possessed the capacity for sudden violence. On Thursday morning, Mrs. Kovach appeared at Elena's door with a garment bag. "For the gala," she announced, placing it on the bed. Mr. Volkov had several selections delivered. This one was deemed the most suitable. Elena opened the bag and experienced a momentary cessation of breath. The gown was the color of a midnight sky, its design simple but its quality evident. The material felt like liquid. She inspected the price tag and felt a visceral shock at the quantity of zeros. "This is unwearable," she stated. The reasoning? "It is valued higher than my vehicle." A twitch registered on Mrs. Kovach's face. "Then the car is what needs upgrading." That was not the subject's concern. The concern, Mrs. Volkov, is your attendance at an event predicated on public scrutiny, on your identity and origins. Judgment was purpose. The elder woman's expression moderated, provide no basis for criticism. Elena felt an internal refutation, a belief she owed no validation to strangers, but Mrs. Kovash was already departing. Accessories are also provided. I will assist with your hair tomorrow. After she left, Elena fixated on the dress, a somatic tremor returning to her hands. She had suppressed thoughts of the gala, which she framed as being exhibited like a new asset. Now, with less than 48 hours left, she felt incapable of the required performance. She located Rosie in the library, engrossed with drawing materials on the floor. Damien occupied a nearby leather chair, his laptop present, but his attention fixed on Rosie's creation. That is quite vibrant, he observed. It's a dragon, Rosie clarified, but a benevolent one, not hostile. I understand. Does the dragon have a designation? Steve. Damien's facial expression remained unchanged. Steve is a suitable name for a dragon. Elena made a sound to announce her presence. Both of their heads turned. I require a word with you, she addressed Damien, regarding tomorrow. He closed the computer. Rosie, could you afford us a moment? May I continue drawing? You may. Rosie resumed her activity, her concentration immediate. Damien rose and beckoned Elena to a more private section of the room. What is the issue? He inquired. I am unprepared for my role tomorrow night. The admission was delivered rapidly. I lack the behavioral script for these functions. I do not know how to engage. I will become a source of embarrassment for you. You will not. How can you be certain? Your sole responsibility is to maintain proximity to me and allow me to manage all discourse. His tone framed the instructions as elementary. If directly questioned, provide an honest but concise response. Do not volunteer data. Make no attempt to impress. What if they inquire about our meeting? Inform them we met via mutual acquaintances. It is sufficiently vague to be plausible and dull enough to deter follow-up. Elena assumed a self-protective posture, arms crossed. What if I'm recognized from my previous employment? That is unlikely. The attendees do not frequent such establishments. This was meant to be a reassurance, but instead amplified her feelings of social alienation. I will sabotage this for you, she said softly. Damien paused before closing the space between them, forcing her to angle her head up to maintain eye contact. Attend to my words, he began. You withstood abandonment by Marcus before 200 guests. You agreed to this arrangement to shield your child. You signed a terrifying contract as a strategic decision. His voice was low and intense. You possess more strength than you credit yourself. One gathering of tedious people will not shatter you. Elena blinked, unbalanced by the conviction in his voice. Is that your genuine belief? I do not articulate what I do not believe. She felt a desire to accept his assessment, but a visceral fear remained lodged in her chest. What if I err nonetheless? Then that is a contingency we will manage. He retreated, re-establishing their distance. Abandon this expectation of failure. Observing it is fatiguing. The remark stung, yet it successfully disrupted her cognitive spiral. Elena took a deliberate breath and then a second one. All right, she agreed. I will make the attempt. Good. He consulted his watch. I have a call in 10 minutes. Was there anything further? No, that is all. He gave a nod and departed, laptop in hand. Elena returned to the floor beside Rosie, who had transitioned from the dragon to a depiction of a family unit. "Who is this?" And Elena asked, indicating a figure with yellow hair. "That is you, Mommy." "And this one?" "That's me." Rosie intensified the purple on the smaller figure's attire. "And that is Damien." The third figure was depicted apart from this pair, tall and dark. Rosie had drawn him without a smile. "Is that your perception of him?" Elena asked gently. "As separate from us?" Rosie gave a slight shrug. "He is nice, but he is not, Daddy. He is just present." The stark observation struck Elena with force. It was an exact diagnosis of Damien's role, an entity in their shared space but not integrated into their dyad. "Do you like him?" Elena inquired. Rosie gave the question serious thought. "He does not raise his voice, and he permits my drawing in the library. Yesterday he explained the fountain." She embellished the drawing further. "I prefer Mrs. Kovash, however. She knows the correct way to make grilled cheese." Elena laughed involuntarily. "What is the correct way?" "The cheese must be fully melded, and the bread texture must be precisely crunchy." "That is, in fact, the correct way." They colored in a state of quiet accord. Through the large windows, afternoon light filtered past the trees. The peacefulness created a somatic ache in Elena's chest. She reflected on the scenario's potential: the house, the security, the relief from financial duress. If only it were authentic and not a constructed reality. That evening, Damien introduced the topic Elena had been avoiding. "I have retained a tutor for Rosie's instruction, he stated, dissecting his steak. "She commences next week." Elena's hand froze in transit to her mouth. "What?" "A tutor for early childhood education, literacy fundamentals, and basic arithmetic." "She is 4. That is the age to initiate preparation for formal schooling. She requires no tutor. She recognizes letters and can count to 20. She is developing appropriately." Damien put down his silverware. "I am not critiquing her development. I am providing her with an advantage." "An advantage for which I made no request." "The contract stipulates I am responsible for her education. This is a component of that." Melena's grip on her fork tightened. "You should have consulted me on this." "I am consulting you now." "That is not a request, it is a declaration." Their gazes locked across the table. Rosie, sensing an unfamiliar tension, registered the conflict. "Are you fighting?" she inquired softly. "No, darling," Elena responded with haste. "A simple discussion." "It has the sound of a fight." "I assure you, it is not." Elena's expression conveyed a clear accusation toward Damien. He displayed a trace of discomfort. "Your mother and I have a differing perspective on your welfare, that is all." "Oh," Rosie responded, moving food on her plate. "I dislike when you are angry with each other." "We are not angry," Damien stated, a falsehood delivered with kindness. Post-dinner, after Rosie was asleep, Elena located Damien in his study. Tapping on the ajar door, she stated flatly, "We must establish protocols." He looked up from his reading. For instance, you do not make unilateral decisions about Rosie without consulting me. The contract is explicit. Substantial decisions mandate consultation. A private tutor is not a substantial decision. It is, from my perspective." Elena entered the room, determined not to be cowed by the opulent furnishings. "I am her mother. I have a voice in her upbringing." "I am not attempting to remove that from you." then cease behaving as though you are the sole authority on her needs after less than a week. Damien shut the folder on his desk. You are correct. I should have conferred with you first. The concession surprised Elena. Oh, very well, but I maintain a tutor is a sound idea. This estate is isolated. She requires social contact beyond you and Mrs. Kovac. She has Sarah. Sarah is employed full-time. Then I will place her in a preschool. In the city? That is a 1-hour commute each way. Elena hadn't considered the logistics. The estate's seclusion, once a minor point, now felt like a cage. There has to be a closer option, she insisted. There is not. None that would provide the standard she merits. Damien arose, rounding his desk. The educator I have sourced is exceptional. A former primary school teacher, a specialist in early childhood development. She is available for 3 weekly sessions of 2 hours each. Rosie can meet her initially to gauge their rapport. If it is unsuitable, we will pursue an alternative. His logic was sound. It was aggravatingly sound. Elena's instinct was to continue the dispute on principle alone, but she lacked a rational basis. Fine, she conceded, but I will interview this tutor before she is left alone with Rosie. Agreed. And if my assessment is negative, we find another. Naturally. Elena started to exit, but paused. Why are you so invested? In Rosie's education, I mean. This arrangement is temporary. In 3 years, we will be gone. Damien's features altered, an inscrutable emotion crossing his face. 3 years is a significant period in a child's maturation. I prefer she benefits from her time here, rather than merely tolerating it. That is almost a kindness. Do not seem so shocked. I am still analyzing you. And I wish you success with that endeavor. A slight curve formed on his lips. I have been attempting the same for 36 years with little progress. It was the first sign of humor she had witnessed from him, a hint of something beneath the cold facade. Elena almost returned the smile. I should retire. Tomorrow will be demanding. Attempt to rest. You will require your strength for the gala. The reminder triggered a fresh wave of anxiety. Yes, the gala. I can hardly wait. You will manage, Elena. The way he spoke her name caused an unexpected flutter in her chest. She ignored it, departing before he could notice her blush. Saturday came with alarming speed. Elena passed the morning with Rosie in the garden as a distraction, but her thoughts drifted to the evening's ordeal. The gown, the judgmental eyes, the role she would have to play. By 4 o'clock, Mrs. Kovac announced preparations must begin. Will this truly require 3 hours? Elena inquired. If we are fortunate, Mrs. Kovac guided her to the bathroom. Begin with the bath. The oils are in the cabinet. Use the lavender. I am capable of bathing myself. Are you capable of a bath that leaves you appearing as if you have never known a day of labor? Mrs. Kovac arched a brow. Because that is our objective. The bath was soothing, though Elena felt absurd in the scented water as Mrs. Kovac arranged cosmetics like surgical tools. Later, robed in a garment that likely cost more than her former wardrobe, Elena sat at the vanity. You possess a strong bone structure, Mrs. Kovac noted, applying a substance to Elena's face. Defined features? We will accentuate them. I appear fatigued. All people appear fatigued. That is the function of cosmetics. She adjusted Elena's chin. Remain still. The procedure felt interminable. Foundation, concealer, powder, eyeshadows of unidentifiable shades. Mrs. Kovac worked with artistic concentration, pausing to evaluate her progress. May I inquire about something? Elena asked during a lull. Certainly. How long have you been in Damien's employment? Mrs. Kovacs' hands never ceased their work. 8 years. What is he like as an employer? He is fair, but exacting. He demands excellence and compensates accordingly. She selected a new brush. What is your reason for asking? I'm trying to understand him. He is remarkably opaque. Mr. Volkov is a private man, always has been. Mrs. Kovacs' face softened minutely. But he is not a cruel man, and he is protective of his property. I am not his property. Are you not? You wear his ring, reside in his home, and raise your child under his protection. Her gaze met Elena's in their reflection. Whether you accept it or not, you belong to him now for at least the next 3 years. The statement should have angered Elena. Instead, it merely amplified her sense of entrapment. Mrs. Kovacs completed the makeup and began on her hair, creating an elegant coiffure that appeared effortless. Finished, Mrs. Kovacs said at last. Observe. The subject, Elena, registered a sense of dissociation from her reflection. The image presented was that of a polished individual, engineered for high society functions. Cosmetic applications had altered her facial structure, creating prominent zygomatic arches and enlarging her optical features. My appearance has altered, she noted softly. You now appear as Mrs. Volkov, the attendant, Mrs. Kovacs stated, providing the garment to finalize the change. The dress adhered to her form, accentuating contours the subject typically concealed. Its dark hue enhanced her complexion, counteracting a pale presentation. The footwear elevated her stature, inducing slight instability. Mrs. Kovacs then applied valuable, understated adornments, diamond studs and a fine bracelet. A platinum ring, delivered previously and bearing a large gem that induced anxiety in the subject, was also worn. Optimal, Mrs. Kovacs concluded. He will register his approval. My intent is not to gain his approval. Regardless of intent, the outcome is assured. An auditory signal at the door redirected their attention. Damien's voice inquired, Is the subject prepared? Transportation is ready. Elena regulated her breathing, adjusted the garment, and opened the portal. Damien presented in formal attire that amplified his imposing demeanor. A rapid but comprehensive visual scan followed. Your appearance is satisfactory, he stated. A deflation in the subject's posture was observed. Merely satisfactory? That was intended as praise. You are upskilled at praise. This is known. He extended his arm in a formal gesture. Elena accepted, exhibiting heightened sensory awareness of his physical presence. Upon descending, their shared reflection created an illusion of a legitimate couple attending a social function, a construct the subject found nearly plausible. The event was located at a downtown hotel of opulent scale, with elaborate crystal light fixtures. The event space was defined by marble pillars. The subject observed attendees in costly attire, displaying vocal tones indicative of high social status. Her grip on Damien's arm intensified, a clear stress response. Regulate your respiration, he instructed quietly. Your performance is adequate. We have only just arrived. And you remain conscious. This is an improvement. The subject displayed a suppressed humor response. As they navigated the assembly, she perceived focused observation and social assessment. Damien moved with practiced composure, acknowledging acquaintances with brief verbal exchanges. An individual identified as Victoria initiated contact. I was uncertain of your attendance. Victoria, your appearance is healthy. Your capacity for deception is poor. Victoria's attention shifted to Elena. Identify this individual. This is my spouse, Elena. Victoria's expression registered surprise. Spouse? What is the timeline of this development? It is a recent event. Specify recent. Sufficiently recent. Damien's inflection indicated a conversational boundary. Pardon our departure. Negatory. You will not depart so readily. Victoria physically redirected Elena away from Damien, linking their arms. I require a full account of your courtship and proposal. The subject exhibited nonverbal signs of panic toward Damien, who responded with a subtle nod of assurance. Our introduction was via mutual acquaintances, Elena stated, adhering to the pre-established narrative. The circumstances were unremarkable. Unremarkable? Damien Volkov avoids the unremarkable. Victoria guided her to the beverage station. You must recount how you secured the city's premier single male. I did not secure him. We merely ceased the false humility. Numerous females have attempted to entrap him, yet you succeeded. Victoria procured 2 glasses of sparkling wine, offering one to Elena. I am both impressed and highly inquisitive. The subject ingested the beverage as a stalling tactic. The carbonation caused a mild pharyngeal irritation. The details are sparse. Details are never sparse. Your profession, origin, familial connections of note. The rapid questioning induced cognitive strain in the subject. She responded with evasive and generalized statements, attempting to mask her feelings of social displacement. Damien intervened at her side. Victoria, cease your inquiry of my wife. It is not an inquiry, it is rapport building. A distinction exists. The distinction is negligible. He removed the subject's glass. We have social obligations to attend to. You have lost your sense of amusement, Victoria noted. Proceed with your networking. I will reconnect with Elena. Upon their departure, the subject displayed an unsteady exhalation. That was highly stressful. Your performance was commendable. She posed approximately 30 questions in 5 minutes. That is Victoria's standard mode of interaction. Damien directed her to a collection of senior males. This next group will prove more challenging. Maintain a pleasant expression and remain silent. His assessment was accurate. The dialogues became an indistinct series of unfamiliar financial transactions and names, inducing a state of cognitive vertigo in the subject. The subject stood by Damien, affecting a smile at intervals, suppressing a strong desire to withdraw from the environment. The name Marcus was then introduced into conversation. A regrettable situation with that Chen individual, one male commented. Reports suggest a significant misappropriation of funds. The subject exhibited a physiological stress reaction. Damien placed a hand on her lower back, a steadying gesture. A closed matter, he stated calmly, unworthy of discussion. Nonetheless, it must be difficult with your wife's previous... I stated the topic is closed. Damien's vocal volume remained constant, yet a tonal shift induced a visible pallor in the other man. Is that understood? Affirmative. My regrets. The assembly rapidly dissolved. Damien maintained physical contact, guiding her to an isolated area. Assess your condition, he requested. It is common knowledge. Her vocalization was faint. They are all aware of Marcus. A minority possesses the complete narrative. Most have only suspicions. That individual was informed. Richard is privy due to his proclivity for rumors and his lack of social discretion. Damien reoriented her to face him directly. Direct your gaze here. Elena complied under duress. You bear no culpability, he asserted. Marcus's actions were his own. You were victimized by them. The judgment of others is irrelevant. A simple position for you to take. You are not the subject of the speculation. On the contrary, my marriage to an unknown woman after prolonged bachelorhood makes me a primary topic. A slight smile was observed. The distinction is my indifference to their opinions. I lack that capacity. It is a capacity you possess, but choose not to exercise. His gaze shifted. Follow me. I will introduce you to more agreeable company. The individuals were a senior couple whose affable demeanor induced a slight reduction in the subject's muscular tension. They inquired about Rosie with apparent sincerity, avoiding any problematic topics. By the meal service, the subject's acute anxiety had partially subsided. The multi-course dinner was complex, though she displayed little gustatory engagement. Damien provided quiet commentary on the identities and discussions around them. His hand's proximity to her chair created a thermal sensation she registered. The feeling, paradoxically, was not perceived as invasive, but as stabilizing, a classic symptom. Post-meal, a dancing period commenced. The subject experienced an acute anxiety response when Damien offered his hand. I lack the skill for this type of dance, she communicated in a low tone. It is simple. Mirror my movements. That statement typically precedes difficult tasks. Place your confidence in me. She did not, yet complied to avoid social scrutiny. He guided her to the dance area among other pairs. He placed one hand on her waist and clasped her other. The subject attempted to recall choreographed motions from media. Cease cognitive analysis, Damien instructed softly. Simply respond to my movements. I will likely make contact with your feet. I will endure it. The experience was less traumatic than anticipated. His guidance was firm, requiring minimal cognitive effort from her, merely a response to physical cues to maintain balance. As they traversed the floor, the subject's anxiety continued to de-escalate. Observe, Damien noted. Your performance is not deficient. An exceptional compliment. I am being literal. Your functioning tonight has exceeded my projections. Your skill with praise remains underdeveloped. His lip showed a minor spasm. It is in development. Following a period of nonverbal interaction, the subject noted their physical proximity and the olfactory stimulus she was beginning to associate with security. May I pose a question? She asked. Permission is granted. What was the true necessity for a spouse? The provided rationale feels incomplete. Damien's facial expression became guarded. The information you have is sufficient. Given our marital status, I believe I am entitled to a less redacted account. After a prolonged silence, he responded, My financial holdings are in jurisdictions with traditional social norms. A prolonged single status can imply instability. A married man is afforded advantages denied to a single one. The arrangement is therefore entirely for public perception. In my operational sphere, perception is paramount. Objective reality is a subordinate concern. That sounds exhausting. It is, but it is also highly effective. His eyes met hers as the music concluded. Damien pulled back, reestablishing a distance. Elena felt the loss of his body heat instantly. I must confer with an associate, he stated. Will you be all right for a moment? I will manage. He gave a curt nod and vanished into the throng. Elena remained at the edge of the dance floor, resisting the feeling of abandonment. Mrs. Volkoff, She turned to see a man in his mid-20s in an expensive suit. "I'm James Kensington. My father conducts business with your husband." He extended a hand. "I wish to introduce myself." Elena accepted it, thankful for the friendly gesture. "A pleasure to meet you. I must admit you are the subject of much speculation tonight. Damien marrying was not a predictable event." "So, I understand. For what it is worth, I believe it is wonderful. He is always so stern. Perhaps you will humanize him." James indicated the bar. "May I offer you a beverage? You appear to be in need of one." Elena paused, then gave a slight nod. "Yes, thank you." They moved toward the bar, James making effortless small talk. It was a pleasant, normal interaction, the first she'd experienced all evening. She did not notice the woman's approach until she was upon them. "Well, well," the voice was frigid and sharp. "So, this is the celebrated new wife." Elena turned, facing a striking blonde whose gown likely exceeded the value of Elena's car. The woman surveyed her with open disdain. "I'm sorry," Elena began. "Have we been introduced?" "Not formally. I am Natasha Fedorova." She announced the name as if it held great significance. When Elena's expression remained blank, Natasha's smile sharpened. "Damien's former girlfriend." Elena's stomach plummeted. "Oh, oh, indeed," Natasha sighed, closing the distance between them. "I must say, you are not what I anticipated. I expected an upgrade, not the opposite." James shifted beside Elena. "Natasha, perhaps what, James? I should welcome her, feign my approval of this arrangement." Natasha's gaze was like ice. She ensnared him, some unknown with a child who likely orchestrated the pregnancy. It is utterly pathetic. A flush of heat rose in Elena's cheeks. "I did not ensnare anyone. Please, as if Damien would marry a person of your standing otherwise. You are a charity case, his latest philanthropic endeavor." Natasha leaned closer. "And when his interest wanes, and it will, he will discard you back into the squalor from which he retrieved you." Elena's hands trembled. She wanted to retaliate, but her voice was gone. It was then that Damien's voice sliced through the air. "Natasha, walk away." The blonde whirled around. "Damien, I was simply acquainting myself with your wife. You were insulting her. I heard every word." He positioned himself between them, his posture suddenly protective. "Leave, now." "You cannot be serious about her. This entire charade is absurd. I will not repeat myself." A quality in his voice made Natasha pale. She cast one final, hateful look at Elena before stalking away. Damien then turned to Elena. "Are you unharmed?" "Fine." The word was steady, though she felt ill. "I am fine. You are not." He took her arm. "Come, we are leaving now." "We can't just leave. People will—" "I am indifferent to what people think. You have done enough this evening." He guided her to the exit, his pace deliberate and constant. Elena registered surprised expressions and overheard murmurs, but Damien gave no indication he perceived them. In the car, the shaking she had suppressed was finally released. She clasped her hands to still the tremor, but the effort failed. "I am sorry," she said. "For what?" "For my poor handling of that, for letting her provoke a reaction. She is a vindictive woman, angry that I have moved on. You are not at fault." Damien loosened his tie. "I should have warned you she might be present." "You were involved with her?" "For about 6 months, 2 years ago. It concluded poorly." "She still appears to be quite invested." "Natasha is invested in her projection of me, not the reality." He gazed out the window. She wanted the status, the wealth, the influence. When it became clear I would not grant her access, she attempted manipulation. I ended it. She accused me of entrapment. This is a classic case of projection, assigning her own strategy to a rival. Elena pivoted to face him. Was the pregnancy a deliberate gambit? Among other tactics, his jaw muscles clenched. That case file is not worth reopening. They proceeded in silence. Elena observed the city's distorted lights, attempting to process the data from the evening, the social event, the ritualized dancing, Natasha's verbal assault. My thanks, she stated at last, for the intervention. You carry my name. Even as a legal fiction, I will not permit public degradation. Nevertheless, the act held significance. He offered no verbal response, but a micro-expression indicated a slight softening of his demeanor. Upon reaching their residence, Elena discarded the pain-inducing footwear. Damien removed his jacket, placing it on the stair banister. Your performance tonight was adequate, he observed. More than adequate, in fact. My survival felt marginal. You navigated a room of predators with flawless composure, a feat few subjects manage on initial exposure. Elena assessed him, the complex individual she had contracted out of duress. He had demonstrated protective behaviors, suggesting a degree of investment. May I pose another query? She asked. This is becoming a pattern. What was the true cause for terminating your arrangement with Natasha? Damien paused for a protracted moment. He then stated, because she viewed me as an instrument for an objective. Every interaction, every shared moment was a calculated maneuver. I grew fatigued of analyzing her true motivations. And you perceive me differently? I know you are different. You signed a binding contract with a 3-year termination clause. You are not attempting to manipulate a permanent integration into my life. You are merely attempting to survive. He ascended the staircase. That is a refreshingly direct motive. Elena observed his departure, sensing a shift in her own affective state, a complex and disorienting response she was not prepared to analyze. Upstairs, she confirmed the status of Rosie, asleep amidst plush toys, before proceeding to her own quarters. She removed the high-value dress, the expensive jewelry, and cleansed the cosmetic mask from her face. Her reflection presented her baseline self, fatigued, uncertain, yet authentic. Her mobile device vibrated, displaying a text from the contact Sarah. Inquiry. Status of evening. Elena remained on the bed's edge, formulating a response. The gala was a high-stress stimulus. Natasha had been an antagonist, and she had simulated marital intimacy with Damien. It was a complex scenario, she transmitted. Debriefing tomorrow? She placed the device aside and reclined, observing the ceiling. Tomorrow, Rosie would be introduced to the tutor. The following week would likely present another social trial, another performance evaluation of her capacity to inhabit the role of Mrs. Volkoff. But for a brief interval this evening, the role had not felt entirely like a performance. That psychological dissonance was more alarming than any external threat. The tutor presented on Tuesday morning with a satchel of educational materials and a facial expression assessed as genuine. The individual, Claire Stevens, was in her mid-40s with empathetic eyes and the calm disposition of a seasoned pediatric specialist. Elena met her at the entrance, with Rosie concealed behind her. Mrs. Volkoff, a pleasure, Claire stated, extending her hand. And this must be the child. Rosie emerged, displaying a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. A quiet greeting was offered. The tutor, Claire, presented books as a benign offering, reducing her stature to the child's level. An inquiry was made about viewing the items. The child, Rosie, sought approval from her mother, Elena, who gave a permissive nod. A positive response was indicated. In moments, Claire had the child engaged with illustrated material on the library floor. Elena observed from the threshold, maintaining a guarded posture, her threat response system fully activated. "The subject is skilled," Damien noted from behind, causing a startled reflex in Elena. His early return was unexpected. He claimed a desire to witness the event. He assumed a casual stance, his evaluation of the scene with Claire and Rosie unreadable. A query about her approval was posed. A definitive assessment was deferred. However, within the hour, even Elena's resistance yielded. Claire was deemed perfect, patient without being patronizing, engaging without overstimulation. The child was already requesting her return on Wednesday and Friday. The time was proposed as consistent, pending approval. Elena affirmed, then corrected her tone. Gratitude was expressed for her effectiveness with the child. She is a cognitively advanced subject. This will be an enjoyable process. Claire offered Rosie a smile. A farewell until Wednesday was stated. The child reciprocated with an enthusiastic wave. Following Claire's departure, Rosie displayed heightened affect, presenting Damien with the book she was permitted to retain. He simulated genuine interest, prompting the child for further detailed explanations. Elena found herself observing their interaction, this figure of power and her young daughter, and experienced a disquieting somatic sensation in her chest. "Mother, did you observe the rabbits?" Rosie initiated. The observation was confirmed. They are quite appealing. Claire indicated the next session would focus on numerics, possibly with a counting exercise. Rosie positioned herself beside Damien, exhibiting complete comfort. "Are you familiar with counting?" He feigned ignorance, stating a willingness to acquire more knowledge. "I can provide instruction. That would be appreciated." Elena withdrew, seeking Mrs. Kovacs in the kitchen. The elder woman was engaged in lunch preparation, her movements betraying practiced skill. "Was the tutoring session successful?" Mrs. Kovacs inquired without shifting her gaze. "Yes, she is effective." Elena took a seat at the island. Rosie is receptive to her. "And your assessment?" "My assessment is that Rosie's receptiveness is a positive outcome." Mrs. Kovacs' expression shifted subtly. "That is not an equivalent statement. It is understood." Elena idly traced the countertop. "It is difficult to accept assistance, particularly from him." "For what reason?" "Because there are no altruistic acts. A price is always exacted." "Mr. Volkov is not billing you for this service. The currency is not monetary, but rather behavioral expectations, a sense of obligation." "Oh." Elena paused, unable to verbalize the specific anxiety. "My concern is Rosie forming an attachment to a variable that will be removed in 3 years." Mrs. Kovacs ceased her work. "May I offer direct observation, please? You are expending so much energy protecting against future emotional injury that you are failing to process current reality." She gestured toward the library from which the child's laughter was audible. "Your daughter is exhibiting happiness. She is secure. She is being provided opportunities previously unavailable. Perhaps instead of anticipating a negative outcome, you could accept that some positive actions lack a coercive motive." The statement registered with more impact than Elena anticipated. "You believe my threat assessment is exaggerated? I believe you are being cautious, but a line exists between caution and emotional unavailability." Mrs. Kovacs resumed her task. "Mr. Volkov is a complex individual, but in 8 years, I have never witnessed him inflict harm upon anyone undeserving. If he states he will provide protection for you and your daughter, he is sincere. For 3 years, that duration exceeds the reliability of most commitments. Elena had no counter-argument. She remained seated, processing the sound of Rosie's counting from the other room, and considered the validity of Mrs. Kovacs' perspective. The subsequent weeks established a predictable pattern. Claire's sessions occurred 3 times weekly, and Rosie thrived with the focused instruction. Damien maintained his schedule of early departures and late arrivals, yet he consistently joined them for the evening meal. Elena began to acclimate to the routine, despite conscious efforts to remain emotionally detached. One Friday evening, a significant disruption occurred. After settling Rosie for the night, Elena was reading in the library when she detected agitated vocalizations from Damien's study. She attempted to disregard it, as his affairs were not her concern. But the volume escalated. A crash followed, indicative of breaking glass. Elena was ambulatory before making a conscious choice to act. She arrived at the study as the door opened abruptly and an unidentified male exited, his face flushed with rage. "This is not concluded, Volkov," he projected over his shoulder. Damien appeared, his attire disheveled, his jaw tense. "Yes, it is, and if you appear at my residence again uninvited, you will face consequences." The man departed, the front door closing with enough force to vibrate the windows. Elena was immobilized in the hall, her heart rate elevated. Damien registered her presence, and his demeanor changed. "How long were you present?" "Sufficiently long. Who was that individual?" "A person of no consequence." His importance seemed significant, judging by the altercation. Damien massaged his face, suddenly appearing depleted of energy. "A former associate who made unsound choices and now requires my intervention. I refused." The exchange sounded more significant. It was not. He began to close the study door, then hesitated. "I apologize for what you overheard. It will not be repeated." "Damien, wait." Elena closed the distance. "Are you unharmed?" "Your hand is injured." He looked down at his knuckles, which were actively bleeding from a laceration. "It is nothing. It is not nothing. This way." She took his arm before he could object and guided him to the kitchen. He followed with surprising acquiescence. Elena directed him to a seat at the island and retrieved the first aid supplies kept by Mrs. Kovacs. "I am capable of managing this myself," Damien stated. "I have no doubt, but I am managing it now." She located the kit and returned, taking his hand. The wound was not deep, but contained glass fragments. What was the object of the impact? A whiskey glass? A lapse in judgment, evidentially. She debrided the wound with care, removing small shards with forceps. Damien observed her actions in silence. "This will cause a stinging sensation." She applied an antiseptic. He showed no reaction. "You are proficient at this," he remarked. "Rosie is 4. I am practiced in treating minor abrasions and removing splinters." She dressed his hand with gauze. "There. Refrain from striking additional glassware. I will make an effort." They remained in silence briefly. Elena noted the residual tension in Damien's posture and facial muscles. The preceding argument had clearly affected him. "Do you wish to discuss it?" she inquired. "No." "Understood." She began to store the medical supplies. "He accused me of embezzlement," Damien disclosed abruptly. "Alleged that I manipulated contracts to exclude him from earned profits. All fabrications. Yet he threatens to involve authorities to file a formal report. Is that a viable threat? He can submit documents. It will lead nowhere. The contracts are legally sound and my records are meticulous." Damien's jaw tightened. "But it is the principle. I provided him with opportunities when others would not. I extended trust, and this is his repayment. That sounds analogous to Marcus, Elena stated softly. Damien's gaze sharpened. Explain? Assigning blame to others for his own shortcomings, adopting a victim narrative when he is the agent of his own failure. She met his gaze directly. Some individuals cannot assume responsibility for their actions. He observed her for an extended moment, and a subtle shift occurred in his expression. You comprehend, to a greater degree than you realize. She paused, then continued, I am sorry that occurred, that an individual you trusted betrayed you. It is a risk of doing business. It happens. That does not mitigate the emotional impact. The flash of vulnerability in his features was so brief, Elena questioned its existence. But it had been present, authentic and human. Thank you, he said, for the dressing and for listening. You're welcome. He rose, flexing the bandaged hand. I have work to complete. Good night, Elena. Good night. She observed his departure, then remained in the quiet kitchen, attempting to analyze the interaction. She had glimpsed the man behind the facade, the person beneath the cold control, and it made him seem less of a captor and more of a person she could potentially understand. The following morning, Elena was awakened by Rosie's kinetic energy on her bed. Mother, awaken. I am awake. What is the issue? There is no issue. Damien said we could go to the city today, the entire group. He mentioned a museum with dinosaur exhibits. We can see if you approve. Please approve. Elena sat up, her cognition still slow. He stated that? Yes. He is downstairs consuming breakfast and instructed me to ask you, can we please go? Elena rubbed her eyes. Allow me to speak with him first. Go attend to your dental hygiene. Rosie departed at a run, already fixated on her dinosaur excursion. Elena moved from bed and went downstairs in her sleepwear. Damien was in the dining room with coffee and a newspaper. He looked up at her arrival. Dinosaurs? Elena asked. The Natural History Museum possesses a notable paleontology collection. I hypothesized Rosie would find it engaging. Since when do you take Saturdays off? Since I concluded I have not had a full day of rest in 3 months. He lowered the paper. If you feel apprehension. No, the desire is present. The proposal is merely unexpected. Is the stimulus positive or negative? Elena processed the query. Positive, I believe. Rosie is already exhibiting high levels of anticipatory excitement. Then our departure time is in 1 hour. The museum was saturated with family units, children moving erratically between exhibits. Rosie's pupils dilated upon entering the dinosaur hall and observing the massive Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton. So large, she vocalized. That is a Tyrannosaurus Rex, Damien informed her. One of the largest carnivores of its era. Define carnivorous. It means it consumed meat. Rosie's eyes widened further. Like chicken nuggets? Elena produced a laugh. Of a sort, but on a larger scale. They spent 2 hours ambulating through the exhibits, with Damien translating complex data for Rosie's comprehension, while Elena observed with moderate surprise. She had not projected his proficiency on this subject, nor his patience with the child's persistent questioning. What is the source of this knowledge? She inquired when Rosie advanced toward a Triceratops display. I engaged in extensive reading as a child. Paleontology was a subject of specific interest. You were a dinosaur enthusiast? Does that finding surprise you? Marginally. I am experiencing difficulty visualizing a juvenile Damien fixated on fossils. A slight curve formed on his lips. I was an atypical child, quiet, solemn, more invested in books than in social interaction. What was the catalyst for change? Life? Reality? the realization that literature is insufficient preparation for genuine survival. He observed Rosie indicating a feature on the skeleton, but the subject remains fascinating. They proceeded through the museum, pausing at the gift shop. Rosie selected a plush triceratops, clutching it as a high-value object. "Permission to acquire?" she asked Elena. Elena noted the price, wincing internally. $25 for a stuffed object was excessive. Perhaps a smaller item. "Acquire it," Damien stated, already accessing his wallet. "That is not your responsibility, I am aware. It is my volition." He presented his card to the cashier before Elena could formulate a counter-argument. Rosie clutched her new acquisition. "Thank you, Damien." Acknowledged. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm. They walked to a nearby park, and Rosie moved ahead toward the play structures. This was a positive experience, Elena noted from a bench with a clear view of Rosie. "Thank you for initiating it. Your tone suggests surprised. I am somewhat surprised. This scenario approximates normalcy. We are 3 individuals spending a Saturday. That is a normative activity. We are a contractually bound couple and a 4-year-old child simulating a family unit. That is highly abnormal." Damien sat beside her, extending his legs. "Does the distinction between authentic and simulated matter if all participants derive positive affect from it?" A philosophically complex query for a museum excursion. "I contain multitudes." Elena laughed, an involuntary response. "Did you just reference Walt Whitman?" "I told you my childhood reading was extensive." They sat in a comfortable silence, observing Rosie repeat her descent on the slide, each time declaring it superior to the last. "May I ask you something?" Elena said after a time. "You ask me many things, and your responses are rarely fully transparent. A fair assessment. What information do you require? What was your primary motive for suggesting this outing today?" "The museum." Damien paused for a moment. "Yesterday, you observed me in a compromised state. Angry, exhibiting a loss of control, striking an object like an adolescent. I wished to demonstrate that this is not the totality of my psychological profile." The candor surprised her. "I did not judge you negatively for it." "Is that accurate?" "No. I perceived you as human." She turned to face him. "You are always so controlled, so regulated. Witnessing an authentic emotional response was, in a way, a relief. Most individuals prefer the controlled version. Most individuals do not cohabitate with you." He met her gaze, and a non-verbal exchange occurred. A phenomenon Elena could not classify but felt as a physical sensation in her chest. Then Rosie approached, breaking the moment. "Mother, there is an ice cream vehicle. Can we procure some?" Elena looked at Damien. He shrugged. "Why not?" They procured ice cream. Chocolate for Rosie, vanilla for Elena, none for Damien until Rosie insisted he sample hers, and he took a small portion to placate her. They sat on the grass while Rosie recounted data about every dinosaur, every fact, every notable detail of the day. As they returned to the vehicle, Rosie was resisting sleep, clutching her triceratops. "Waking her for the evening meal will be a challenge," Elena remarked, glancing at her sleeping daughter. "Then we will postpone or skip the meal. It lacks importance. You are demonstrating remarkable flexibility today. Do not grow accustomed to it." But his tone contained a warmth that was previously absent. At the estate, Damien transported the sleeping child upstairs unprompted. Elena followed, observing him place her daughter gently on her bed, still holding the dinosaur. "She is forming an attachment to you," Elena stated quietly in the hall. "Is that a problem? The data is incomplete. Ask me in 3 years when we must explain your absence. We will manage that variable when it becomes salient. For now, permit her to experience contentment." He moved toward his wing before hesitating. An admission today yielded unexpected gratification. Her concurrence was noted. He departed. Subject Elena retreated to her room, exhibiting signs of acute cognitive dissonance. The initial agreement was transactional, a 3-year simulation of a relationship for security. Effective responses were not a variable in the original arrangement. However, observation of the target, Damien, displaying atypical tenderness toward the child, Rosie, appears to have compromised her psychological defenses. The structural integrity of her self-preservation mechanisms shows a distinct fracture, and she lacks the methodology to repair it. The subsequent week introduced a new controlled environment, a corporate dinner. The subject, adorned in an emerald green garment, anticipated further social evaluation. The outcome was unexpectedly positive. The associates were welcoming, a tactic to foster inclusion and normalize the subject's presence. Damien's physical contact, a hand on her lower back, was a constant, proprietary gesture that was losing its alien quality to her. During the return transit, his demeanor was uncharacteristically relaxed. He assessed the evening as successful. She agreed, noting his colleague's affability. He corrected her terminology. They are partners, a distinct classification. The distinction, he explained, is absolute loyalty. Partners provide support. Colleagues are merely co-workers. Subject Elena processed this ideological framework. The differentiation is confirmed through time and observation under duress. He provided a case study. The Andersons, who, after a financial collapse 15 years prior, were restored by his capital injection. Their loyalty, he implied, was the significant return on investment. This aligns with Mrs. Kovac's prior assessment of his value system. The subject then posed a critical question, an involuntary probe for her own status. "And me? Do you trust me?" After a calculated pause, he offered a minimal positive reinforcement. "I'm starting to." He dismissed the contractual basis of their arrangement, reframing her continued presence as volition rather than duress. He argued she possessed avenues of escape she had chosen not to utilize. He maintained focus on the road. "Your inaction is not from inability, but from a lack of will to leave." The accuracy of this assessment induced a state of terror in the subject. She offered a rationalization. "Fear." He countered, suggesting it was an acclamation to the arrangement's benefits. She had no rebuttal. Later, after confirming the child was asleep, the subject deviated from her routine, seeking out Damien's study, a clear indicator of a developing attachment. He was present. He inquired about her sleeplessness without diverting his attention from a screen. She hesitated, seeking permission to enter. He granted it, reminding her of her supposed standing. She confessed the accuracy of his earlier analysis, admitting she could have resisted more. She then deflected, attributing her compliance to the child's well-being, a classic use of a proxy to mask personal emotional shifts. When questioned about her fears, she identified the primary anxiety, the blurring of the line between the simulation and reality, the fear of habituation to him. Damien ceased his activity. He posed a rhetorical question to minimize her concern. Would that be so terrible? He closed the distance between them, a nonverbal assertion of dominance. He then presented a strategic reframing of their contract. He acknowledged the termination clause, but proposed an alternate interpretation for the intervening 3 years, an abandonment of the pretense. He suggested they cease resisting the roles they were playing. The subject correctly identified this as a dangerous psychological proposition. She cited the inevitable collateral damage to the child when the arrangement concluded. He then revealed his gambit. The divorce would end the marriage, but not his connection to Rosie. He offered to remain in the child's life, thereby ensuring his permanent influence and making a clean separation impossible for Elena. The subject expressed disbelief. His justification was simple: an attachment had formed with the child. This statement appeared to breach Elena's remaining emotional defenses. Her subsequent outburst, cataloging his contradictory behaviors, menacing yet kind, distant yet protective, is a textbook response to the intermittent reinforcement used to cultivate a trauma bond. Her stated inability to discern his motives is the intended outcome of this manipulation. His feigned uncertainty, "I don't know what I want," is a tactic to appear vulnerable and disarm her. He then deployed a specific targeted piece of emotional intelligence, referencing a moment he observed her genuinely smile. He reframed her imprisonment by stating his desire for her happiness within the arrangement, a classic maneuver of a benevolent captor. When she questioned his motive for caring, he delivered the pivotal statement. He claimed that within the past month, she had transitioned from a contractual object to an individual of significance. The confession, engineered to sound genuine, created intense physiological and emotional reactions in the subject. She correctly identified this development as a deviation from the contract. He agreed. Despite her verbal acknowledgement that this was a poor course of action, neither subject moved. The proximity became charged. He then initiated minimal physical contact, a touch to her hair, a calculated boundary breach. His directive for her to retire, framed as a prevention of impulsive acts, was a masterful assertion of control, leaving her in a state of heightened emotional arousal. Her internal conflict between the contract's logic and her conditioned emotional response indicates the success of his psychological campaign. Damien's previous statements regarding his emotional investment continued to occupy the subject's thoughts. The psychological distance they had enforced was collapsing, leaving her uncertain whether to reinforce her defenses or surrender. She located him in the kitchen. For a brief moment, he displayed a flicker of vulnerability before his composed facade was restored. A practiced micro-expression. She attempted to initiate a debrief of the prior night's events. He initially deflected, a test of her intent before acquiescing to her insistence. The subject then made a key verbal concession, admitting her negative feelings toward the arrangement had dissipated. This confession confirmed she has begun to internalize the revised reality he has constructed. She articulated her fear. The child's attachment to him would make the contractual endpoint in less than 3 years traumatic. She saw no scenario for a clean disengagement. After a deliberate pause, Damien presented his ultimate proposal. What if there was no exit? This nullified the subject's single psychological safety net. He suggested that at the 3-year mark, they re-evaluate rather than terminate. He systematically devalued the contract, labeling it a mere piece of paper and not a death sentence. This maneuver aims to replace a defined legal boundary with a fluid, indefinite emotional arrangement. By proposing they stop anticipating a conclusion they might not want, he actively dismantles her ability to mentally prepare for freedom. She correctly identified the implication. He was proposing to make the simulation real. "I'm proposing we allow it to evolve organically," he stated, framing total control as a passive process. The subject's physiological response, trembling hands, indicated high anxiety. Her request for time to process was a final, feeble assertion of agency. He magnanimously granted it, already assured of the outcome. As he departed, he delivered a final, potent statement designed to cement her sense of importance. She was the first person in years to make him desire something beyond a business acquisition. He was then gone. The subsequent weeks entered a new phase of behavioral normalization. Damien's modified schedule and increased familial interactions served as a consistent reinforcement schedule, rewarding the subject's compliance. Her hypervigilance toward his minor acts of consideration indicates the full transference of her focus onto him, a key symptom of her condition. The unclassified scar tissue on his left hand remained a data point she could not reconcile. Her analysis of him was a systematic deconstruction, a process evoking equal measures of terror and elation. The past then manifested as Marcus Chen. Subject Elena was in the garden with the child, Rosie, when the housekeeper, Mrs. Kovac, appeared with a distressed expression. "An individual is at the gate," she reported. "He requests you." He identifies as Marcus Chen. A physiological shock response was observed in Elena. "What?" "The security detail has intercepted him, but he insists on speaking with you, citing unresolved matters," the child inquired from her position in the flower bed. "Who is Marcus?" "An insignificant party, my dear." Elena's cognitive functions accelerated. "Mrs. Kovac, could you supervise Rosie indoors?" "Affirmative." The older woman offered her hand. "Come, child, we will prepare cookies." The child complied readily, verbalizing preferences for the activity. Once they were gone, Elena activated her phone with visibly trembling hands to contact Damien. He responded instantaneously. "Identify the issue. Marcus is present at the gate. He is requesting a meeting." A period of silence ensued. Then, "My arrival time is 20 minutes. Do not approach him. That is not my intention." "Elena, I must be clear. Remain inside the residence. I will manage this entity. He is my responsibility. His status as your sole problem ceased on our wedding day. Permit me to resolve this." The connection terminated. Elena remained in the garden, exhibiting self-soothing behaviors, attempting to process the reappearance of Marcus. After his acts of betrayal, embezzlement, and abandonment, his audacity was notable. She entered the house, but displayed agitated pacing. She checked her mobile device every 30 seconds, showing a pronounced startle response to auditory stimuli. Finally, the sound of Damien's vehicle on the gravel signaled his arrival. He entered with 2 security officers, his facial expression rigid. His location? He remains at the gate, denied entry by security. Correct. Damien removed his jacket, placing it on a chair. Remain here. I wish to accompany you. Negative. Damien, please, I require a visual confrontation. I must. Her vocalization faltered. I must face him without psychological collapse. He analyzed her facial cues, and a subtle shift in his demeanor occurred. Very well, but you are to remain by my side. If I issue a directive to return to the house, you will comply. Is that understood? Understood. They proceeded to the gate, flanked by Damien's security. Through the iron barrier, Elena observed Marcus beside a rented vehicle. He appeared diminished. He exhibited weight loss, and his attire was downgraded from expensive suits to jeans and a creased shirt. Upon seeing Elena, his expression shifted to one of relief. "Elena, thank heavens. I've attempted contact for weeks." She observed him, the man she had nearly married, and registered only cold anger. "State your purpose." Her voice was more stable than anticipated. "I need to clarify the events, the reasons for my departure." Marcus approached the gate. "The situation was not as you perceived. I was compromised. I acted out of panic, and I regret my abandonment of you." You misappropriated $12 million, Damien stated, his tone flat and menacing, and you left her to face the consequences. Marcus's gaze darted to him with apprehension. I am unaware of your intel, but I did not steal anything. It was a miscalculation involving investments. Do not present falsehoods to her. Damien's vocal tone was exceptionally cold. I possess records of every fraudulent transaction, each falsified account, and every client you defrauded. You are a thief, and your freedom is a direct result of my decision not to initiate legal proceedings, because you wanted her. Marcus's composure fractured, revealing his desperation. You intervened as soon as I was gone, marrying her before the wedding arrangements had even wilted. That is not a coincidence. You are correct, Damien confirmed. It is not. It is an opportunity. You left a liability and a woman deserving better. I presented a solution. A solution, Marcus emitted a bitter laugh. You entrapped her, likely used coercion, leveraging the debt until she had no alternative. Is that your assessment of the events? Elena stepped forward, her hands clenched. That I was so powerless, I submitted to intimidation? I know your psychology, Elena. You lack the fortitude to oppose an individual like him. The verbal stimulus struck her with force. For a moment, Elena regressed to the altar, humiliated and believing Marcus's assessment of her as weak and helpless. Then Damien's hand on the small of her back provided a steady, warm anchor, triggering a psychological shift. You have no accurate profile of me, she stated, her voice gaining resolve. You knew a version of me desperate enough to internalize your deceptions. The woman who believed someone like you was capable of genuine attachment. That persona is gone. Elena, please! I chose this arrangement. Damien presented the terms, and I accepted because I can recognize a beneficial contract. My daughter has stability, I have security, and I am not burdened by debt from your failures. She advanced closer to the gate. Do you want the differential analysis between you and him? He has been transparent from the beginning, cold certainly, demanding yes, but transparent. You engaged in deception every day of our association. Marcus's face flushed. You are making a critical error. He is a dangerous variable, Elena. Do you believe his motives for marriage were altruistic? Men of his profile act only with purpose. You are correct. He had motives, and he disclosed them to me rather than concealing them. Elena felt Damien's hand apply more pressure, reinforcing her stance. Now vacate this property before I personally notify the police of the precise location of a fugitive who embezzled millions. You would not. Test the hypothesis. Marcus looked between them. Elena witnessed his realization of defeat. His objectives, manipulation, financial gain, or disruption, were unattainable. You are suited to one another, he spat. Both of you enjoy your fabricated marriage and life. He entered the rental car and departed at high speed. Elena watched his exit and felt a release of psychological tension. She had confronted him without collapse, without demanding explanations or apologies. She had demonstrated strength. Damien's hand moved from her back to her shoulder, turning her to face him. Are you stable? I believe so. She exhaled unevenly. That was a high-stress event. Your performance was optimal. I nearly faltered. When he asserted I was not strong, I almost accepted his premise. But you did not. That is the critical outcome. His gaze searched her face. You possess more resilience than you recognize, Elena. I have attempted to communicate this since our first meeting. Elena looked at this complex, high-risk man, who had become her primary support system. Thank you for your presence, for your tactical support, always. The word was simple but carried significant weight. They returned to the house, and Elena realized that for the first time since Marcus abandoned her, she felt liberated. The feeling was not contingent on debt forgiveness, residence in a mansion, or financial security, but on the self-validated proof that she could stand independently without fracturing. That evening, after the child was asleep, Elena located Damien in the library with a book and whiskey. "May we conference?" she asked from the doorway. He immediately set down his book. "Of course." Elena entered, secured the door, and sat opposite him. Vocal clearing. "I have been processing your statement about allowing this situation to evolve organically, and I am afraid the fear persists, but my exhaustion with being afraid now outweighs the fear itself." She manipulated her wedding ring, the permanent one. "Rosie inquired today if you would now assume the role of daddy, distinct from father, a daily presence. What was your response?" "I provided a factual account that you are my husband, you care for her, and you are now a component of our family unit." Elena's eyes watered. I then realized the statement was true. "In recent months, you transitioned from a stranger in a contract to family." Damien set down his glass and knelt before her, taking her hands. "Elena, allow me to finish." She took a shaky breath. "The contract stipulates 3 years, and it is possible we will reach that termination point with mutual animosity, ready to separate. But it is also possible we will not. Perhaps we will arrive there having constructed something real and worth preserving. What is your proposition?" "I am proposing an authentic attempt. Not mere cohabitation while counting down to a deadline, but the active construction of a shared life." She squeezed his hands. "I am stating that I am developing a deep emotional attachment to you, Damien Volkov. It is terrifying, but I am ceasing all avoidance behaviors." His eyes closed briefly. When they reopened, they held an intensity Elena had not previously observed. "It is critical you understand me. I am not a simple man. I am controlling and demanding, with adversaries who could target you as a vector to me. Choosing me, will not be straightforward. I do not require simple." Simple was Marcus, and that outcome is noted. Elena reached to touch his face, tracing his jawline. "I require real, complex, messy, real." "I have no precedent for this," he admitted quietly. "This emotional state regarding another person, to want something beyond enterprise and power. Then we will develop the protocol together. Model." Subject Damien initiated physical contact with an intensity calculated to overwhelm the subject's emotional defenses. Subject Elena reciprocated, channeling months of suppressed anxiety and nascent attachment into the exchange. Upon cessation, Damien articulated an expectation of future error. Elena's response indicated a willingness to engage in reparative behaviors, typical of individuals forming a bond. Damien then escalated his emotional disclosure, framing his attachment as terrifying. Elena sought clarification on the nature of this fear. They remained in physical proximity, a silent consolidation of their altered dynamic. The environment was secure. The child, Rosie, was documented as safe. Elena's primary fear, the emotional legitimization of her contractual marriage, was being realized. Resistance had ceased. A third-party confidant, Sarah, offered a contrary analysis. "You're developing an effective bond with him," she observed during a meeting while the child was otherwise occupied. "Affirmative." Elena, the arrangement was designed to be terminal. That is also understood. What then is the protocol when the contract expires? Elena disclosed. We have discussed permanence, the conversion of this arrangement into a genuine marriage. Sarah's reaction was one of disbelief. Is this a serious consideration? It appears to be. No definitive action has been taken, but the possibility is under review. Do you harbor feelings of love for him? The direct inquiry forced a confrontation with her internal state. Yes, she conceded. I believe that is the case. But does he reciprocate? He has not verbalized it, but his behavior is indicative. His protective actions toward us, his focus on Rosie, his physical possessiveness in public settings. Elena exhibited a faint smile. His verbal communication is limited, but his actions are sufficiently clear. Sarah offered tactile support, stating, My concern is you will sustain emotional injury. Injury is a known risk. Emotional bonds lack guarantees. Elena contrasted her current psychological state with that of 6 months prior when she operated under a victim-savior delusion. I would prefer to accept the risk than to live with the ambiguity of an unexplored outcome. When did you develop this resilience? It became a necessity for Rosie and for myself. She added, Damien was a catalyst. He perceives me differently. Not as a subject requiring rescue, but as an agent capable of her own salvation. That is a surprisingly elegant formulation, Sarah conceded. I find it problematic but elegant. Elena responded with laughter. You do not find it problematic. I find the impending retraction of my negative assessment of him problematic, but no, the concept itself is not. That evening, Elena located Damien in his study. She signaled her presence. Am I interrupting? His demeanor shifted. My attention is always available to you. Who? That is a statement consistent with a spousal role. I am rehearsing. He ceased his work. What is the subject of your thoughts? Elena positioned herself on his desk. I have been analyzing the contract, specifically the protocols for year 3. Damien's expression remained deliberately unreadable. Proceed. My conclusion is that we should terminate the agreement. His brow furrowed slightly. Elaborate. Not the legal articles. The debt absolution, financial safeguards, those remain. But the clause mandating dissolution, I want that expunged. Elena, permit me to respond. I am aware of the established timeline for this decision. I know we committed to a deliberate pace, but I do not require 3 years to confirm my intentions. I desire this arrangement to be reclassified as permanent. I wish to exist without a predetermined endpoint. I want to construct a life with you, free of an overarching expiration date. Damien rose and closed the distance between them. Are you certain? Because upon this revision, upon making it real, I will not release you. So, excellent. I have no desire to be released. He framed her face with his hands. I love you. The declaration was delayed until I could ascertain you were psychologically prepared to process it. Elena's respiration faltered. You love me? With a desperation and totality I did not know I could generate. He made contact with her forehead. You have fundamentally altered my existence, Elena. This structure was merely a building before you and Rosie. You have made it a home. Saline tears initiated on her cheeks. I love you too. The intensity's disquieting. Understood. We will experience the disquiet together. He then initiated a kiss, a slow, deep gesture signifying future commitment. Upon breaking contact, Elena was smiling through her tears. "So, this is our course of action?" she asked, to make it official. "We are already married. Officiality cannot be increased. You comprehend my meaning?" "I do. And yes, this is our course of action." He drew her into an embrace. "I will have legal counsel draft an addendum to the contract, one that codifies this as a permanent, real arrangement." "And the settlement, the capital I was to receive after 3 years?" Sweat. "A trust will be established in your name. You will always possess financial security and autonomy. I will not have you feel confined." Elena pulled back to regard him. "I do not feel confined. For the first time in my life, I feel unconstrained." 2 weeks later, the new agreement was executed. It was a substantially shorter document outlining financial securities and provisions for Rosie, with all references to dissolution excised. Damien's legal counsel appeared perplexed. Elena's counsel seemed pleased. Patricia Stern smiled, as if this outcome had been a foregone conclusion. "Congratulations," she stated. "On this occasion, your choice is mutual." Her assessment was correct. The initial contract was a product of desperation. This event was a product of will. That night, they engaged in a quiet celebratory ritual with the child Rosie, dining outdoors. Rosie remained unaware of the event's gravity, but for Elena and Damien, the significance was clear. At that table, observing their daughter, they acknowledged that they had secured an outcome neither had sought: a functional marriage, a cohesive family unit, a viable future. 6 months thereafter, Damien performed a conventional proposal, not with a contract, but with a custom-designed ring and a speech that elicited a strong emotional response from Elena. They repeated their vows in the original location, but the audience now consisted of individuals with an emotional investment in their union. Sarah, as maid of honor, displayed a more intense emotional reaction than Elena. Mrs. Kovas was positioned in the front row, expressing pride. Rosie, the designated flower girl, performed her duties with noted seriousness. When Damien kissed his bride, a genuine kiss, unlike the prior chaste gesture, the social approval was authentic. Post-ceremony, Elena reflected on her profound psychological shift. "What is on your mind?" Damien inquired. "I was recalling how, 1.5 years ago, I stood here believing my life was over. And now? Now I understand it was merely beginning." She turned to him, the man who had intervened in her crisis. "Thank you." "For what?" "For identifying something in me that warranted protection, investment, and love. That was the simple variable. You yourself generated those qualities. I merely possessed the acuity to recognize them." Rosie approached, her attire already soiled. "Is it time for the cake?" Elena laughed. "Yes, my child, it is time for the cake." They proceeded to the reception as a single unit, a family formed from necessity but cultivated into a resilient structure through deliberate choice. In later years, when queried about their meeting, Elena would provide a sanitized narrative about opportune timing. She would omit the failed first wedding and the legal contract, as these facts were incongruent with the primary story. The primary story concerned a woman who discovered her own resilience, a man who lowered his defensive barriers, and a child who acquired a devoted father figure. The primary story was about two damaged subjects who ceased their avoidance of attachment and constructed a lasting, stable bond. When Rosie reached maturity and inquired about her parents' courtship, Elena would provide an accurate account that positive outcomes can arise from negative stimuli. and that choosing to act despite profound fear is the most critical decision one can make. Damien founded a charitable organization in Elena's name dedicated to providing financial and logistical support to single mothers. Elena administered it directly, applying her own experience with powerlessness to empower others. Rosie developed in an environment of love and resources, never questioning her value. At 16, Damien legally adopted her, not from obligation, but from mutual desire. And Elena, the woman who once stood trembling at an altar, abandoned and shamed, concluded that salvation is not always an external event. Sometimes, with adequate support and the courage to accept a risk, one saves oneself. The remainder is merely finding an individual strong enough to stand beside you during the process. Elena had found that individual in the least probable subject, a stranger with cold eyes who entered her crisis and offered not rescue but a strategic partnership. That distinction made all the difference.